Welcome to History at the OK Corral. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and share this episode with a fellow history lover. The Old West was a dangerous place. Finding oneself in the wrong place at the wrong time could, and all too often did, wind up in death and disaster. Tonight, join History at the OK Corral for 10 terrifying stories of some of the most brutal ways to die in the Old West. Northern Wyoming, December 21st, 1866. As battle cries and screams of agony ring out all around him, 32-year-old Adolf Metzger is in a desperate fight for his life. Tucked back into the scarcely discernible shelter of a crevice amidst a field of boulders, the young German-born immigrant fights ferociously, swinging his weapon with all of his might as guttural exhortations fly unconsciously from his lips. His attackers, who have all but laid waste to his comrades, are a collection of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, hundreds strong, fighting under the command of the legendary Red Cloud. They wield bows, arrows, lances, knives, and tomahawks and advance upon their ensconced quarry with the myopic fury of a hungry pride of lions. Metzger, for his part, wields only a small brass instrument, a bugle, that he desperately swings as dozens of lances and arrows berate his position. To a random passerby, this spectacle would doubtless appear curious, if not slightly comical, were it not for the deadly serious consequences of the fight at hand. But, as curious as the sight might be, it is anything but a random encounter. Adolf Metzger is a soldier in the United States Army, serving in the 2nd Cavalry Regiment, C Company. At 5 feet 8 inches tall, with brown hair and blue eyes, he cuts a similar figure to many of his comrades who now lie cold in death around his position. He serves as the company bugler, a critical position in a time before radio communication. Metzger's job is to belt out the appropriate tunes on the bugle to denote attacks, retreats, and various maneuvers. The U.S. Army has determined that buglers need both hands free in order to properly execute their duties, and thus, the only weapon that Metzger has left is the diminutive brass instrument, with which he now makes a desperate last stand. Though he now stands here incurring the consequences of the United States government's repeated offenses against the Northern Plains nations, Metzger is but a poor soldier, at the mercy of his commanders and his duty. 6 months earlier, in June of 1866, the 2nd Cavalry, under the command of Colonel Henry B. Carrington, had ridden out of Fort Laramie in what is today southeastern Wyoming and into what is known as the Powder River Country with orders to protect immigrants traveling on the Bozeman Trail. A treaty had been agreed to with most of the powerful Northern Plains nations in 1851, including the Cheyenne, Lakota, Arapaho, Assiniboine, Mandan, Hidatsa, and Crow tribes. Signed in the very fort Carrington had ridden out of, it is known as the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. The treaty had designated this area in the Powder River Country as belonging to the Crow tribe, and guaranteed it immunity from incursion by either rival tribes or American settlers. However, a decade and a half of dwindling buffalo herds and increasing encroachment from westbound immigrants has driven the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho into more and more desperate straits. Fed up with the lack of trustworthiness exhibited by the United States government, the mighty Red Cloud has gathered a formidable army of highly motivated warriors intent not only on forestalling westward expansion, but on eliminating every soldier, settler, and rival tribe from their territory for good. While many of the soldiers now serving in the post-Civil War Army are indeed accustomed to combat and the hardships of life on the trail, none of them, nor their superiors, have seen anything like the warfare being waged upon them by Red Cloud. For the next few months, after their arrival in the Powder River Country, as they labored and constructed the fort that would be their home, the soldiers dealt with incessant attacks from warriors riding under the command of Red Cloud. Even after the fort was completed, Colonel Carrington was reticent to send any patrols outside of its walls in order to engage and deter the constant onslaught of piecemeal attacks. As the casualties mounted and the frustration amongst the ranks grew, Carrington's subordinate officers, most notably Captain William Fetterman, began to insist more and more vociferously that the only way to stop the attacks was to take the fight to Red Cloud and his warriors. Carrington and Fetterman had both served in the Union Army during the Civil War, though both men had had wildly different experiences throughout the conflict. While both had served honorably, Carrington, a Yale-educated officer and highly regarded as a masterful bureaucrat, had not seen combat on the front lines. Instead, he had solidified his reputation as a tireless organizer and, by war's end, had become head of a Union spy ring being run out of Indianapolis. Carrington, as well as his superiors, saw this excursion into the Powder River country as an opportunity to garner the 42-year-old a measure of actual combat experience and pad his otherwise exemplary record. Whether due to his disposition, inexperience, or simply differing discernment of the situation at hand, Carrington had repeatedly denied his officers permission to pursue the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. By December of 1866, this had caused an increasing level of discontent amongst nearly everyone ensconced within the timber confines of the fort. While no major engagements had taken place, it seemed to the inhabitants of the fort that one or two of them were turning up dead with alarming regularity. Among the most vocal proponents of taking up a more offensive course of action against the native attackers is Captain Fetterman. In stark contrast to his superior officer, Captain Fetterman has seen frontline action in the Civil War. He had participated in the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, as well as Sherman's March. After the conclusion of the Civil War, Fetterman had stayed in the U.S. Army with the intentions of becoming a career officer. Though Fetterman's father had served as an officer in the Army, he had been orphaned as a young man and in his late teens denied entrance into West Point. Though he had gone on to assemble an impressive military resume, the combined lack of both a familial and educational pedigree imbued the captain with a burning sense of ambition. Though it was not an uncommon exhortation amongst American officers on the plains, Fetterman had repeatedly claimed that with a force of 80 men, he could wipe out the entire Sioux nation. Finally, after being ordered by General George Cooke to take the offensive against the murderous and insulting attacks, Carrington began to take a more aggressive approach against Red Cloud and his warriors. On December 6th, Carrington received word that a wagon train of woodcutters was under attack. The woodcutters, men whose job of venturing out into the nearby woods to procure timber was quickly becoming one of the most dangerous professions on the frontier, were roughly 4 miles west of the relative safety of the fort walls. Immediately grasping the gravity of the situation, Carrington ordered Fetterman to lead a company of cavalry and a squad of mounted infantry directly to the scene, while he led another attachment north to cut off the retreat of the warriors. Carrington had, in fact, made tactically astute decisions. However, 2 young lieutenants named Drummond and Bingham had led 3 other troops in pursuit of a small group of warriors, only to wind up in an ambush. Drummond and 2 others had managed to escape, narrowly making it back to rejoin their commander with several of Red Cloud's warriors in hot pursuit. Carrington had then found himself and the remainder of his contingent surrounded by roughly 100 warriors. However, with the arrival of Fetterman and his backup, the attacking warriors were compelled to retreat north, disappearing over the rolling hills. As Carrington and his men re-entered the walls of Fort Kearny, it was all too obvious to those of them that had seen combat in the Civil War that this, combat on the open plains, would be an altogether different business. Those who had never experienced combat before this were chilled to the bone by the realization that they were all a very long way from home, with limited support, surrounded by their enemy in their enemy's own land. It must have seemed to many that their saving grace would indeed be their faction's superior technology. While U.S. Army soldiers who had fought the Plains tribes prior to the Civil War had been largely armed with single-shot rifles and early iterations of the Colt revolver, these men were equipped with weapons developed largely over the course of the preceding 6 years. The officers among them generally carried the Model 1860 Colt or 1858 Remington 44 caliber revolvers. The typical infantryman carried the Springfield Model 1863 rifle musket chambered in .58 caliber, while the typical cavalryman was armed with either a Spencer Model 1860 52 caliber or Model 1865 50 caliber 7-shot repeating carbine. The warriors fighting under Red Cloud are largely armed with only their traditional bows, lances, shields, and war clubs, with only a few warriors armed with 44 caliber revolvers and single-shot flintlock rifles. This discrepancy in firepower is, it is now obvious to most, the only thing keeping them alive here in the unforgiving austerity of the snow-laden Powder River country. In their after-action reports, Carrington and Fetterman concurred that the lack of discipline and organization exhibited by the troops during the engagement was indeed cause for great concern. Fetterman commented that this Indian war has become a hand-to-hand fight, requiring the utmost caution. The one man in the fort with significant experience in fighting the tribes of the northern plains was the 62-year-old legendary mountain man, trapper, scout, explorer, and frontiersman Jim Bridger, who served as a lead scout for Carrington. Bridger, who for weeks had observed the increasing difficulties of the young soldiers in dealing with the attacks from the native warriors, remarked to the general that, "Your soldiers don't know anything about fighting Indians." Carrington had immediately redoubled the training of his troops, drilling them incessantly and making abundantly clear to the officers, time and again, that caution must be exercised in all engagements, attacks must be limited, and all maneuvers made in the interest of minimizing their men's exposure to danger. The number of guards on duty was doubled, and all of the 50 remaining horses of the fort were to remain saddled from dawn to dark in case of an immediate need. On December 19th, the drilling and precautions seemed to have paid off when General Carrington had ordered a captain named Howell to assist a group of woodcutters under attack. Following his orders with scrupulous detail, Howell had indeed managed to force the attacking warriors into retreat. He had not allowed any pursuit of the warriors and had returned safely with the woodcutting detail in tow. The following day, Carrington had refused the request of Captain Fetterman and Captain Brown, another veteran officer, to take a contingent of well-armed civilian employees of the fort on a raid to disperse or capture a Lakota village situated roughly 50 miles away on the Tongue River. This almost certainly saved the lives of all the proposed participants, as the village was much larger and much more ready to make war than the captains realized. However, the cavalrymen's respite from the cold of death would be tragically all too brief. It would be only a day later, on December 21st at about 10 a.m., when General Carrington was alerted of a band of warriors yet again harassing a party of woodcutters. The morning had been clear and cold, and while another attack had been expected, most had hoped their advancing from the fort might come in the comparatively warmer hours of the afternoon. By all accounts of those present, Carrington gave Captain Fetterman clear orders not to pursue the warriors over Lodge Trail Ridge that lay to the north of the fort. He was only to proceed northwest, reinforce the security detail accompanying the woodcutting party, and return. Under no circumstances, Carrington ordered, are you to pursue over the ridge to the north. Captain Fetterman departed the fort not long after 10 a.m. Captain Brown, soon to receive orders to leave the fort and loath to pass up one last opportunity at avenging his fallen countrymen, volunteered to go as well. Issuing the call to advance outside the gates had been Adolph Metzger, whose steady intonations hid a growing unease rapidly taking hold of his nerves. Marching forward under the directives of Metzger's bugle is the largest relief force yet sent out by Carrington, including a detachment of infantrymen on foot. Leading a small detachment of cavalry assigned to support these men on their way to the battlefield is Lieutenant George Drummond, who only days earlier had narrowly escaped death by impetuously pursuing a party of warriors into the ambush that had killed Lieutenant Bingham and another soldier. As the gates to the fort closed, Carrington retreated to his quarters, by all accounts relatively confident in Fetterman's fidelity to his orders, but concerned about the discipline of Lieutenant Bingham, considering his actions on the previous few days. However, with limited men and limited time, he still felt that Bingham was more of an asset than a liability. However, within the hour, before 11 a.m., Carrington would be alerted that Fetterman had, despite his explicit orders, pursued the party of attacking warriors to the north. Within the confines of the fort, the situation is maddeningly inexplicable to the general. Later accounts of the battle from Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho sources shed light on what might have provoked an attack that should have been explicitly prohibited under direct order. Among the warriors attacking the wagon train on this icy northern plains morning is a young warrior with oddly light skin and wavy hair. He had been spotted before by the soldiers and woodcutters alike, standing out not only for his appearance, but his unyielding ferocity. Again and again, when other warriors had retreated, or worse yet, fallen in death, the young man had proven indefatigable in assaulting his enemy. His own people, too, were increasingly impressed with his bravery and selflessness. Though still in his early 20s, the young man was beginning to cultivate a reputation as a fearless warrior and trustworthy leader. As a child, because of his hair, he had been known as Curly. Now, he is known amongst his people as Tisonka Whitco, or Crazy Horse. Crazy Horse and company, upon seeing the arrival of Captain Fetterman and his men, see yet another opportunity to employ one of their favorite tactics, a feigned retreat. In hopes of drawing the army officer's ire and enticing him to follow their feigned retreat into an ambush, Crazy Horse hurls repeated insults at Fetterman and his men, cursing them in English and striking threatening poses as a challenge. Finally, in either desperation or disgust, Crazy Horse had turned his back to the soldiers, dropped his leather leggings, and mooned them. Whether or not this insult is indeed the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back, Fetterman's men did indeed give chase. One possibility later proffered by researchers is that it was in fact Grumman, again at the mercy of his own vainglorious impulses, who broke ranks and began to lead the charge. As the pursuit carried on northward, Grumman and the bulk of the force pulled ahead of Fetterman, Brown, and the remainder of the force by several hundred yards. As they proceeded over the crest of Lodge Trail Ridge, however, they are met with what must have been a sickeningly bone-chilling sight. Thousands of warriors stood ready to meet them. The attack was not sprung until Grumman and his party were near the bottom of the ridge, with Fetterman and Brown between them and the fort. At first, an attempt to stand their ground is made. Then, quickly seeing the futility of this approach, Grumman, leading the contingent of troops furthest down the hill, begins to lead a fighting retreat up the steep slope, intending to reunite with Fetterman. Now, as the battle rages on, the attacking Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho have managed to separate the two forces further. Though he fights valiantly and attempts to lead the men who have followed him back up the hill, Grumman is soon cut down in vicious hand-to-hand combat. As the infantry desperately slip and slide as they attempt to climb their way up the hill, they too are cut down in brutal fashion by arrows, clubs, and spears. Soon, the white snow of the hillside is stained in large swatches of blood and viscera. Fetterman and Brown lead the men still alive under their command to an outcropping of boulders, from where they presumably intend to hold out until reinforcements arrive. They squeeze off round after round, desperately trying to issue orders over the din of rifle fire, war cries, and the screams of the wounded and dying. It is mere minutes, however, before Captain Fetterman is cut down by a hulking Sioux warrior named American Horse, with a devastating blow from his nail-studded war club, after which the warrior leaps from his horse and cuts the American's throat. The outcropping is overrun in short order, with troopers falling all around in their final throes of agony as they are brutalized by attacking warriors. Knowing the fate that now awaits him, Captain Brown fires off every remaining round in his revolver, saving the last for himself. Before he can be overtaken and subjected to the torturous demise of his comrades, Captain Brown falls dead by his own hand. Among the last left alive is Adolph Metzger, who now knows he has but moments left to live. As the hellish reality unfolds around him, perhaps his mind indeed recalls a brief synopsis of his life. Scenes he will never see again. The German countryside of his youth, the countless charges he had survived during the previous few years, and doubtless recollections of his worried mother and beloved, long-suffering wife, Frederica, whom he had married while still on campaign in the summer of 1864. This respite, though, must last only moments. As Metzger continues to swing his instrument, the bugle incurring dents as his body incurs slashes and stab wounds. He backs further into the crevice, now with no room left to retreat. The scene over the next few minutes is one of unabated brutality, as Metzger too is slashed, cut, and bludgeoned until he finally falls dead on the cold Wyoming ground. The last American soldier left alive during this engagement, one that will come to be known as the Fetterman Massacre, or Fetterman's Fight, is now gone. To the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, the success of their tactics is inarguable. Before this battle, a Sioux medicine man had reported having a dream, in which he had held 100 dead blue-coat soldiers in each hand. In the lore of the Sioux, the battle is known as the Battle of the 100 in the Hand. This engagement would be the most costly ever inflicted upon the U.S. Army until a full decade later, when many of the same warriors would decimate Custer's forces at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. For Red Cloud, the utter devastation wrought upon the U.S. Army in this engagement is but a pretense of things to come. The Battle of the Hundred in the Hand is but one engagement in what will come to be known as Red Cloud's War, the most successful military campaign ever led by native forces against the United States Army. But the epic tale of how the mighty Sioux chief managed to bring to bear the power of his leadership and his people's resolve in one of the greatest military campaigns in the history of the Old West, as well as the story of how General Carrington responded to the tragic massacre of his men, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Montana, 1836. In the middle of the night, in the dead of winter, a fur trapper named Isaac P. Rose shakes himself free from the warmth of the buffalo robe he has been sleeping in and rises to his feet. In a daze, the man wanders into the freezing, ominous darkness of the woods that surround him and his companion's small campsite. He trudges to a spot a few dozen yards away, feeling inexplicably drawn to a small clearing just beyond the tree line. As he comes into view of the clearing, he is shocked to see the hulking figure of a lone grizzly bear. For the veteran mountain man, the sight of a grizzly here in the wilds near Clark's Fork on the Yellowstone River is not at all unusual. However, this grizzly is standing on his hind legs, nearly 8 feet tall, and staring intently at the bewildered man. Locking eyes with Rose, the bear walks up to the man, striding in an eerily human-like gait, and speaks. He tells Rose, in a deep, steady voice, to shake his hand. Rose, more confused than afraid, offers the hulking beast his left hand. The bear refuses to take it. Rose, sensing the animal's offense, hurriedly extends his right hand instead. At this, the bear silently and solemnly shakes the man's hand with both of its massive paws. Then, the bear suddenly disappears with a gust of icy wind. Just as suddenly, Rose finds himself awakened by the morning sun, still wrapped in the warm buffalo blanket. It had all, of course, been a dream. Rose and his fellow mountain men, a party composed of himself, as well as Joe Meek, Jack Larison, and Mark Head, have departed from their main company in order to procure meat for their starving comrades. The main party, under the leadership of the legendary mountain man Jim Bridger, are camped 30 miles away. They are counting on their comrades to ease the troublesome burden of surviving the harsh winter at hand. They have thus far been successful, as they have managed to kill so many buffalo that, after one day's hunt, 4 of the 8 horses that have been brought along to pack the meat now find themselves burdened by full loads. The snow is deep, and travel has been slow. With another long, cold day ahead of them, the fur trappers begin to pack their things and make ready for travel. As they do this, Rose recounts his strange dream for his companions, partly for their amusement, and partly hoping one of them might proffer an explanation as to the meaning of it. He tells them how Caleb, the colloquial name amongst mountain men for the grizzly bear, had come to him in a dream, that he had spoken and only shaken his right hand. Joe Meek, another veteran trapper, shakes his head and lowers his concerned eyes on Rose. "You had better look out, Rose, or you'll shake hands with Beelzebub before night." While the grizzly bear certainly instills a healthy sense of respect and fear in any mountain man, what they fear most is coming into contact with Beelzebub. Though his name is used in the New Testament as a synonym for the devil, that is not the image that comes to the typical trapper's mind when they hear the word. For these men, the most fearful entity that they might encounter here in the wilds thousands of miles from their places of birth is not the grizzly, nor is it the venomous snakes, buffalo stampedes, wolves, mountain lions, flash floods, avalanches, or wildfires. For the mountain men, their greatest fear is the Blackfoot. The Blackfoot, or Siksika, had originated in the northeast, near the area between the modern-day state of Maine and Canada. They would eventually make their way to the Great Lakes region, and then even further west onto the expanses of the Great Plains of present-day Alberta, Canada, and the state of Montana. They had subsisted in these unforgiving environs for centuries as foot-bound hunters. Before the introduction of the horse into the Blackfoot culture in the 18th century, they had survived by chasing bison herds off of cliffs, gathering at the bottom to butcher the animals. Their cultural transformation to a horse-based people who hunted, conducted warfare, and traveled on horseback was delayed far longer than the tribes further to the south. This was due more to geography than anything else, as the Blackfoot's northerly location placed them farther away from the large populations of horses found in Mexico and Texas. But, however delayed their transformation might have been, it has also been incredibly rapid and incredibly consequential on the northern plains. The Blackfoot had quickly mastered hunting and fighting from atop charging mounts and had proven the most formidable power in the area for decades by the time Isaac Rose and his comrades sauntered into their territory in the 1830s. During the winter months, which could amount to more than half the year in these northernmost reaches of the Great Plains, the Blackfoot would set up their villages in the wooded river valleys. On the rare occasion that they ventured out from these quarters, it was generally to partake in the same practice that Rose and his companions were partaking in. They would hunt the buffalo herds that hunkered down in the wooded areas and harvest as many as they could carry back in order to sustain their families and community until the long-awaited end of winter. The buffalo was more than simply a main food source of the Blackfoot. For the Blackfoot, nearly every tool and furnishing at their disposal came, in some form or fashion, from the buffalo. Properly known as the American bison or plains bison, they are the largest land animal on the North American continent. The largest males can weigh upwards of 2,000 pounds and can be incredibly unpredictable. They roam virtually the entirety of the middle of the continent, from northern Canada to Mexico, in what is known as the Bison Belt. At their peak, most experts estimate their population to range from 30 to 50 million, with some estimates being as high as 75 million. Their thick hides provide the material with which the Blackfoot and other plains tribes construct their teepees. Their bones, hooves, and horns are used to construct tools and cooking utensils. Bison meat is, of course, the basis of the Blackfoot diet. Roasted, fried, boiled, dried, or raw, it could be prepared and consumed in a variety of manners. A particular delicacy for many plains tribes was to squirt the bile from the gallbladder into the cavernous open stomach of a freshly killed lactating female buffalo. This created a yogurt of sorts that many children saw as a treat. To the Blackfoot, the buffalo are a sacred gift from their creator, their way of life, and their livelihood. As such, they see fit to protect their resources by any means necessary. Since the buffalo herds are such an important resource for the Blackfoot, any incursion into their territory, and especially any hunting of the buffalo on that territory, is seen as an offense punishable by death. Hugh Monroe, a Canadian fur trapper who was adopted into the Blackfoot, gives his account of how viciously the Blackfoot dealt with intruders, even of other native tribes. After finding a still smoldering campfire of a neighboring tribe referred to as the River People, the Blackfoot whom Monroe was living with became inconsolably irate and set on revenge. He asked one warrior, a man named Lone Walker, what had happened. Monroe's account is as follows. "The campers here were the River People," said Lone Walker. "We had forbidden them to come over here on our plains, but they keep coming and stealing our buffaloes. We shall now make them cry." "You are going to fight them?" asked Monroe. "Yes," said Lone Walker. "I shivered," recalls Monroe. "In my mind's eye, I saw a great battle, arrows flying and guns booming, and men falling and crying out in their death and agony. And for what? Just a few buffaloes that blackened the plains." "Don't fight," pleaded Monroe. "There are plenty of buffalo. Let the River People go in peace with what they have killed." "But," the Canadian recalled, "he gave me no answer other than a grim smile, and rode out to meet the head of the Blackfoot column." In the ensuing fight, the Blackfoot would kill 7 of the River People's warriors as their women and children fled in desperate panic. All 7 would be scalped and otherwise mutilated as both punishment and warning. Afterwards, a great celebration would be held. The fur trappers are well aware of the danger their venture has placed them in. However, They are also aware that the buffalo meat they return to their company with could quite literally be the difference between a relatively comfortable winter and possibly starving to death in the middle of nowhere. And so, for the time being, they are not dissuaded from their job at hand. The four men continue on with their day, spending it much the same as they had the day before. Rose, the most reliable shot, would fall a buffalo, and then they would all set into quartering and packing the meat. However, after seeing several hundred of the animals, they have proven so unusually skittish that Rose could not get close enough for a good shot. This suspicious behavior spells only one sure thing, according to the mountain man's instincts, that the Blackfoot are nearby. The trappers agree that the best course of action is to return to camp with the buffalo meat they have been able to procure so far. They head southeast through rolling hills. As the men ride, conversation is kept to a minimum, and their eyes continually scan the landscape around them. They are well aware that being caught with a bounty of buffalo meat will likely spell a torturous end at the hands of the Blackfoot. This end could certainly come via a variety of tortures routinely employed by almost all Plains tribes. These include being staked out in the summer sun, burned under red-hot coals, or quite literally being carved to pieces as their torturers, along with the women and children, laugh at and chide them. But a hard death could also, as Isaac Rose and company had found out only a few weeks earlier, be suffered even after escaping from a Blackfoot attack. A Delaware tribesman named Manhead, who had been traveling with the fur company, had been out hunting with Rose when the pair were suddenly attacked by a small group of Blackfoot warriors. Rose and Manhead had managed to make it back to camp, with Manhead suffering only a flesh wound from a bullet in his calf. But as they reached camp, Manhead informed Rose that he had been hit with a dreaded poison bullet, and his demise was all but certain. Over the succeeding hours, the unfortunate Delaware would suffer an agonizing death. In his biographical work on Isaac Rose titled 4 Years in the Rockies, author James B. Marsh addresses the reader directly and how these poison bullets were made. Perhaps our readers may not be aware of the method resorted to by the Indians in poisoning their bullets. It is done this way. A small piece of buffalo meat is placed on the end of a forked stick, and a rattlesnake is induced to strike his fangs into it. This poisoned meat is then dried, pounded into a powder, and placed in a small bag. When the Indian intends to use one of these poisoned bullets, he first puts it in his mouth and chews it for some time, then dips it into the bag, and the slightest wounds from one of these bullets can cause death. As the trappers try to push these fears from their minds and focus on the task at hand, they feel an inexorable tension as the undulating terrain provides ample cover for a Blackfoot ambush. All they can hope for now is to make it back to their company's main camp and the comparative safety and numbers it provides. After a few hours of riding, it seems as though they might actually make it. Then, just as they are about to reach a small ravine, a party of 8 Blackfoot spring up, screaming their defiant, powerful war cries. The lead Blackfoot warrior is scarcely 10 feet from Rose when the attack begins. Rose, in the lead, wheels his horse and is now the closest target for the Blackfoot to attack. Almost as suddenly as he can turn his horse to flee, the air is filled with the roar of gunfire, and Blackfoot musket balls whiz all around him. One of the balls passes through his cap, while another rips across his chest, leaving a jagged but shallow cut across his skin and cutting the strings of his shot pouch, causing the critical piece of weaponry to fall to the ground. Another ball passes through the wrist of his buckskin glove, again miraculously only causing minor superficial damage to his wrist. Rose's most grievous wound comes when one of the lead balls smashes into his right elbow. The ball enters just above the joint and exits through the forearm, rendering the limb all but useless for the time being. The Blackfoot warrior nearest Rose, seeing he is now incapacitated, rides forward to finish the attack. The warrior attempts to grab Rose's horse by its bridle with one hand while attempting to shove Rose from the animal. Rose uses his severely injured right hand to hang on to the reins while he repeatedly strikes the Blackfoot warrior in the face with his riding whip. As he does this, Rose's horse panics and lurches away from the Blackfoot, taking off in a dead run in the direction of the other trappers. This is a fortuitous break for Rose, However, as the horse wheels around to make their escape, Rose's rifle falls from his lap. Rose realizes he is severely wounded, and now without any means of defense save for his hunting knife and tomahawk. His only hope is to hang on as his horse makes a mad dash away from the Blackfoot. He urges the animal onward, doing all he can to hang on to the reins with his one working arm. Looking behind him, he sees the Blackfoot warrior closest in pursuit stop to pick up Rose's valuable rifle from the ground, fumbling with the rifle's leather scabbard. Rose again turns his gaze forward, hunkering down as low as possible next to the horse's neck. Then he hears a sound he is well familiar with, the crack of his own rifle, followed by the sound of yet another ball whizzing by his head. Rose's charging steed manages to catch up to the party of 3 other trappers whose retreat has been slowed by their heavily burdened pack animals. Seeing no better option, Jack Larison cuts the straps holding the loads to the animals, leaving hundreds of pounds of meat spilling upon the rolling prairie. Larison calls out to Rose, "Are you killed, old boy?" "Not killed, but badly wounded," Rose replies. "Hurry forward, boys, and save yourselves if you can." Rose and his cohorts must now cover over 30 miles of prairie in order to get back to the safety of their company. In another fortuitous break for the party, the Blackfoot have halted their pursuit in order to reclaim the buffalo meat dropped by the trappers. Though they are now empty-handed, they are all alive. Rose, however, is beginning to rapidly decline over the course of the ride. His arm throbs in immense pain, and he is wrought with nausea and dizziness. For hours, he rides through icy winds and over snow-covered grounds, his right arm dangling uselessly by his side. It is soon apparent that at least one of his wounds is the result of a poisoned bullet. As the 4 trappers finally reach camp, it is readily apparent to all that Rose is on the verge of death. He is pulled off of his horse and carried into a tent, where Jim Bridger and a Delaware medicine man examine him. Both concur that he is the victim of a poisoned bullet, and has likely only survived this long due to the blood loss he had incurred during his ride. Over the next few days, Rose lies in the tent battling for his life against the effects of the poison and blood loss. His arm swells to a nearly unrecognizable mass, causing fissures in the skin at the shoulder. His nervous system becomes, in his own later words, fearfully disorganized, and even the slightest noise, light, or motion causes him great distress. His fellow trappers do all within their power to care for him, though little can be done other than keeping the wound clean and letting the man sleep as best he can. Most of his friends fear, if not outright assume, he will not survive long. However, after about a week, the wound has begun to heal. Soon, Rose is able to eat and walk, and within weeks, he will be back to work, hunting and trapping. However, Rose will scarcely have regained the ability to hold down food by the time an injured scout limps into camp, seemingly in a full-frothed panic. The scout, a Mexican man known as Massacre, has been shot in the ankle, though thankfully not by a poisoned bullet, and had only escaped certain death at the hands of a roving band of Blackfoot by hurling himself off of a steep cliff which they were not willing to follow him down. Massacre reports that the Blackfoot are coalescing in a winter camp on the Yellowstone River, 4 miles south of the trappers' location. The village is nearly 1,000 lodges strong, he says, and when they discover the trappers' location, the trappers will surely be wiped out. And so, the fight for the frontier will continue. Bridger will order his men to construct a makeshift fort, and the men will hunker down for what will be one of the most brutal encounters between native tribes and mountain men in the history of the Old West. But for tonight, the accounts of that battle, as well as the countless other tales of conflict and coexistence between tribespeople and trappers, are other stories for other times. St. Louis, 1834. On a pleasant springtime morning, a group of 60 young men are busy readying themselves to head up the Missouri River. To a man, their goal in the ensuing months is to make as much money as possible. To do this, they have all signed on as hired hands to the fur expedition of one Mr. Wyeth, a Yankee entrepreneur that sought to solidify his own fortune via the accrual and sale of one of the most valuable resources on the North American continent at the time: beaver pelts. The parlors and cafes of such faraway locales as New York City, London, and Paris were full of men sporting one of the most defining fashion developments of the 19th century, the beaver felt top hat. This fashion craze caused the demand for beaver pelts to skyrocket, and many young men to head west with intentions of securing their own fortunes. This group of prospective trappers, now gathered in St. Louis, are mostly in their late teens and early 20s, with many having made their way to the frontier port city from home states such as New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. Most were, to say the least, serviceable woodsmen, but few had ever ventured into the territory they were now about to. The nervous tension of youngsters on the brink of great adventure and great danger prevailed amongst them, as they were all too aware of the potential risks and rewards of their new endeavor. In the preceding weeks, as they had waited for the company of Mr. Wyeth to assemble and fully outfit itself, the neophyte frontiersmen had watched as many a keelboat had pulled into St. Louis bearing the fruits of their passengers' labors. Vast quantities of seemingly flawless beaver pelts were unloaded by weary but satisfied trappers returning to sell their wares for profit and finally take their leave from the field. However, along with their encouraging bounties, the returning trappers also brought back with them no short supply of hair-raising stories about their run-ins with the tribes upon whose territories their trade required them to encroach. Oftentimes, trappers and frontiersmen were able to broker peaceable agreements with local tribes, with many becoming adopted into or intermarrying with a number of different tribes like the Crow, the Shoshone, and the Mandan. The Blackfoot, however, had proven perpetually combative and unreceptive to treaty, trade, or coexistence. The Blackfoot as a people are actually composed of 4 closely related bands. These are the Northern Piegan, the Southern Piegan, the Blood or Kaina, and the Siksika, often referred to as the Northern Blackfoot. Their reach by the early 19th century was vast, stretching from northern present-day Alberta, Canada, to southern Montana. They had originally come from the east, being one of the first Algonquin language-speaking tribes to migrate westward in order to hunt the vast herds of buffalo upon the open plains. Up until the early 18th century, they had subsisted by hunting the buffalo on foot. They would burn large swaths of prairie in predetermined locations, knowing the smoke and flames would cause whole herds of the lumbering beasts to panic and stampede, upon which they could be run off of cliffs where they would fall to their deaths. Sometime before 1750, however, the Blackfoot had acquired both horses and firearms, and they had used these new technologies to not only revolutionize their approach to hunting, but their approach to warfare. Now heavily armed and highly mobile, the Blackfoot waged merciless war on their longtime enemies like the Cree, the Crow, and the Kootenai. They saw the trapping expeditions who trapped and skinned the plentiful beavers from their lakes and streams and harvested and fed upon their deer, elk, and bear as no more than bald-faced intruders, deserving of neither merit nor mercy. Many a young man newly arrived to St. Louis would find their taste for the freedom and adventure of the wild frontier suddenly soured upon hearing a returning trapper recount tales of finding good friends and comrades' bodies, terribly mutilated and full of so many arrows they resembled dead porcupines. But despite all of the dangers, or maybe because of them, the prevailing mood on this morning is one of joviality and optimism. As the young men stand around in small groups, seeking shade as the sun begins its climb to its noontime apex, they trade stories of wild nights on the town, boast of great deeds yet undone, and rib each other with jokes. One among them, though, is notably less enthusiastic. Though outwardly looking as fit for the job as any of his cohorts to his left and right, a young man known only to history as Howell takes little to no part in the fun. He has, in fact, proven so sullen and melancholy over the last few days, many of the others wonder if he will even board the boat heading west on the Missouri, or whether he will head back home, wherever that might be. His perceived weakness draws the ire of his companions, as is wont to happen in groups of men such as this, when it is seen as more of a merciful fate for all involved to run the weak member out, lest he become a liability for all at some later date in some far less hospitable locale. Howell himself wonders what he will do when the boat scheduled to take them upstream arrives. He had eaten little in the past few days and slept even less. This combination serves only to fray his already strained nerves even further, as his mind drifts and his resolve continues to waver. Time, however, waits for no one, and before noon, the boat has docked only yards away from where the men of the company are waiting. The next few hours are spent loading the men, livestock, and materiel meant to sustain them for several months onto the boat. Finally, with all 60 of the men, including Howell, plus the crew and Mr. Wyeth aboard, the keelboat departs St. Louis, heading up the river towards the frontier. After a few days' travel on the river, the company pulls ashore to make camp. After securing the livestock and eating a much-anticipated supper, the trappers convene in small circles around several small campfires. As each group settles in about the fire, conversation is made about the day's events and expectations of what is to come. Still, Howell remains as distant and melancholy as ever. His compatriots, not lacking entirely in basic empathy, at least not yet, inquire as to what the cause of Howell's seemingly incessant internal turmoil might be. Howell, exhausted by the physical and psychological toll of the day, confesses almost immediately, with equal parts relief and anxiety, that the source of his trouble is the ceaseless worry and heart-sickness caused by the beautiful young woman he had left behind. The following is an excerpt from 4 Years in the Rockies by James P. Marsh, link to purchase in the description. "Well, boys," Howell said, "I suppose you think it's strange that I should always be so gloomy. But I have good reasons for being so. I believe I am today the most unlucky man in the world. Listen, and you can judge for yourselves. I was engaged to be married to one of the nicest girls in St. Louis, and she was just as good as she was good-looking. She was a seamstress and supported herself and her aged mother by sewing for a clothing store. We were engaged last spring and were to marry in the fall, and in the meantime, I was to save up enough money to buy a wagon and a team and go hauling. Well, boys, I shipped on board a steamboat as a deckhand at $30 a month, and I afterwards become a fireman, for which I received $40 a month. I was saving, and by the middle of September had $200 with which I started up to St. Louis. Near Memphis, our boat blew up. There were a great many killed and scalded. I was knocked overboard and picked up in an insensible condition. When I came to, I found myself in bed. My money was gone, and I never heard of it again, and I went back to St. Louis poorer than when I left. My girl received me kindly and bade me of good cheer, but our wedding was postponed till spring, and I hired with a tanner in St. Charles at $25 a month. I understood the business and made a good deal by working extra time, and by February I had $100 extra saved, which I left in the hands of my employer. Well, gentlemen, one night the whole concern burned down, and as there was no insurance, my boss was a ruined man, and so was I. And having now lost all heart, contrary to the wishes of my girl, I joined Wyeth's company, and here I am." "Yes, and you have me to thank for it," chided a man in the company known only as Smith, whom Mr. Wyeth had bailed out of jail with a promise to the local sheriff that his employment would prevent any further rabble-rousing in his town. Smith, a callous and uncaring man by all accounts, then recalled in front of all at the campfire how Howell had attempted to take his traps and desert when the boat had docked briefly in St. Charles. Just before reaching St. Charles, Howell had concluded that he would not, or could not, continue on the trip and determined to head back to St. Louis. He had quietly gathered his traps and, in a moment when all of the rest of the crew were busy on board or engaged elsewhere, attempted to slip off the boat and into the small crowd, leaving no one the wiser as to his whereabouts. However, Smith had spotted Howell packing his things and knew the obvious cause was that of his great anxiety to return to his bride-to-be. Disgusted, Smith berated Howell with insults, telling him not to be such a love-sick baby and to remember the agreement that he had made with the company, one which he was honor-bound as a man to uphold. For a few minutes, Smith and Howell argued in hushed tones, with each becoming more vehement in their position. Finally, just as the boat began to pull away from the shore, Howell jumped off the vessel and onto the shore, determined to make his escape. Smith demanded the keelboat pilot return the vessel to the banks of the river so that he might retrieve Powell. At first, the pilot refused, but he was quickly persuaded when Smith pulled out a revolver and stuck it against the pilot's head. Smith demanded the boat be brought to shore immediately, or he would dispatch the pilot right here and now. As the boat pulled close enough to shore, Smith jumped off, promptly walked up to Howell, grabbed him by the arm, and forcibly dragged him back to the boat, all while verbally shaming him for his lapse in manly virtue. Devastated and terrified, Howell now saw that his fate was sealed, and ever since, he had spent every night tossing and turning at the prospect that he might now never see his beloved again. Now, as the flickering campfire illuminated Howell's forlorn and desperate expression, one of the few older men in the company, a man named Green, seeking to show at least some measure of commiseration with the poor young man, smiles knowingly and reaches into his pocket, from which he procures a piece of hammered gold, again quoting from 4 Years in the Rockies. "Do you see that, boys?" said Green. "That's what started me for the Rockies. That was once an engagement ring. Yes, boys, it's a fact. I was once engaged to be married, and the gal was purty as a peach and spry as a bird, and she thought a heap of me, she did. But I, like a darned fool, got on a bender for 3 or 4 days, and when she heert on it, she sent me back this ring. Well, boys, I took it and hammered out the way you see it now. Wyeth was just getting up his company at that time, and so I joined." Another trapper by the name of Rube, now moved by the other stories and seeking to both share in his cohort's burden and relieve himself of his own, spontaneously chimes in with his own story. "See here, boys, you seem to all be in for telling what started you to the Rockies. Now, what do you suppose started me? Now, you can believe it or believe it not, just as you please, but, honest Injun, it were a cussed old mule. Though, mind you, there were a gal involved, too. You may talk about your pretty gals and your spry gals, there weren't a patchin' in Selina Perkins. She weighed 160 pounds and had a face on her round like a full moon. She was a rouser, she was. Well, we were engaged to be married, and I were to run her daddy's farm, which were about 9 miles from St. Louis. This day afore the wedding, I went into town to buy a critter and fell in with some of my old pards, who were out of the Rockies with me the year before. Well, I began to feel like taking another trip, but I couldn't see how this thing was to be did. There were the gal, and the wedding were to come off the next night, so I thought I'd take a night to consider on it. The next morning I bought a mule I had been looking at the day before, and after running around with the boys all day, towards night I started for home. And would you believe it, I hadn't made up my mind whether to marry or to start for the Rockies. The company would be off the next morning, and as I rid along on the mule I kept studying, but I couldn't come to no conclusion. About 8 miles from St. Louis, the roads forked. One road led to my gals and t'other to town. Just before I reached the forks, a happy idea struck me. By thunder, says I, I'll leave it to the mule. If she takes the right-handed road, it's Mary. If she takes the left, it's the Rockies. So I dropped her bridle into her neck, stuck my hands into my pockets, and said, "Go it, Betts," for that were her name. Well, boys, she took the left, and here I am. I writ Selina a letter telling her to hold on faithful for 2 years. I'd be on them with pockets full of dollars, and we'd hitch for sure and certain without fail. For a brief moment, the all too rare compassion of his fellow trappers gives Howell a much-needed measure of relief. He realizes he is not alone in his suffering, and he is with friends. Howell takes heart in this, thinking maybe things are not so bad after all. He sleeps peacefully for the first time in many days. Then, the next morning, the call goes out to load up, for the company is taking the boat to its final point, as far into the frontier as they can be taken with some relative measure of safety. Now a cold chill goes down Howell's spine, as he is reminded that they are headed into dangerous territory, ruled over by dangerous tribes who had no interest in extending compassion of any kind. The Blackfoot do not care about Howell's homesickness, nor his heartache, nor that of any of his cohorts. They do not care why these men have come to their lands, only that they are here, and that they are trespassing. However, despite the hazards of their endeavor, there is still much work for the trappers to do. The company departs the relative safety of the Missouri River and makes their way onto the prairies and foothills. For weeks, they work from stream to stream, river to river, going out in small groups in the early morning to set traps and returning to check on them periodically throughout the next few days. Though many meet with initial success, they are also quickly fatigued by the incessant danger and intermittent attacks of the Blackfoot. The trappers play an ongoing game of chance, in which they must balance risk and reward every day, constantly evaluating and recalculating their odds and decisions. The more trappers that went out in a group, the more protection could be afforded against Blackfoot attacks. However, this also meant the bounty of pelts would have to be divvied up into smaller shares. This could net the trapper such little gain for such risk that risking a little more to gain a little more could fast become an enticing prospect. It was this ongoing gamble that eventually begins to play on the mind of Howell. Over the ensuing weeks, he and his companions have worked hard and endured much privation and danger. They are now confident, learned how to stay alive in harsh territory. Now, many of them see that they can perhaps count on their newfound sense of self-sufficiency to garner them the fortunes that they seek. Howell decides the risk is worth the reward, as does Green, the man who carries the piece of gold in his pocket. When the company reaches the area of the Yellowstone River, 2 men set out down its banks intending to set traps for the next few miles. All seems well as the country is beautiful, the day is warm, and signs of beaver in the area are plentiful. For a brief moment, perhaps it seems to both men as if things are not so bad out here on the frontier. Perhaps they had done the right thing in coming out here, and that perhaps someday in the not-too-distant future, they would recall this scene and so many scenes like it to the adoring wonder of their wives and children. Then, suddenly, as the men ride placidly up the banks of the river, a party of 6 to 8 Blackfoot appear from around a bend, and all thoughts of love and legacy vanish for both men, now replaced with cold, sheer terror. The pair wheel their horses around and start into a full gallop headed back towards the company's camp. Then, to their horror, they see another group of Blackfoot coming toward them from where they had just ridden. Now, their only option to escape certain death is to make it to the other side of the Yellowstone River and hopefully outride their pursuers before they can cross the river themselves. With seconds to spare until the Blackfoot are upon them, the 2 desperate men lean back until their shoulders nearly touch the canters of their saddles as their mounts make the near vertical descent down the riverbanks into the water. As they do this, war cries from the Blackfoot fill the air, as do arrows from every bow present. As the trapper's horses hit the water, Green slides out of his saddle and swims alongside his horse, using the animal as a shield against the Blackfoot projectiles that rain down all around them. Howell, however, due either to inexperience, panic, or both, stays in his saddle, attempting to ride straight across and up the other bank. This is a fatal error. Before either trapper can make it to the opposite bank, Howell is struck 3 times in the back. Just as their horses begin to find their footing on the opposite bank, he gives a loud, piteous moan and falls forward onto the neck of his mount, dropping his rifle into the water. "Are you badly hurt?" cries Green, over the din of Blackfoot celebrations at falling one of their hated intruders. "I'm a dead man," Howell says, "and you had better leave me and do the best you can to save yourself." Green, to his eternal credit, decries this as an untenable option. He will not, he says, leave Howell to die so long as there is any hope of saving him. Green takes Howell's horse by the bridle, coaxing the animal up the embankment as the arrows continue to fly, and Howell continues to moan and hang on with all of his might. Once they reach the top of the bank, Green tells Howell to bear down as he leads both horses as fast as possible in the direction of the camp. However, they are now on the opposite side of the river from the camp. Though they have secured some measure of a lead over their pursuers, they must again cross the river. They find a marshy area about a mile away from the camp that looks as though it might be fordable before the Blackfoot can reach them, and the men and horses plunge headlong into it in desperate flight. It is here that Howell, unable to hang on any longer, falls from his mount. Green sees he does not have time to load his direly wounded companion onto his own horse, nor can he mount any consequential resistance to the Blackfoot on his own. Thus, he rides for the camp at full speed, alerting his comrades as to the state and location of the fallen Howell. A group of trappers return with him at once and manage to load their suffering cohort onto another horse, all while amassing fire at the Blackfoot. They ride hard and fast back into camp, and Howell is laid out and made as comfortable as possible. But nothing can be done for the man. Howell writhes and wheezes for an unbearably long time. Finally, the unfortunate young man, along with all of his hopes for love and longevity, dies a cold, lonely death many miles from anything and anyone he truly loves. For all the vaunted talk of adventure and fortune, this is the stark reality of the frontier. Howell will be buried where he dies, and once the initial waves of horror and grief pass over the men in camp, a veil of rage descends upon them. Though the story of Howell will end here, the trappers present will go on to mount a revenge raid against the Blackfoot. It will be an attack the Blackfoot will never forget. But for now, that is another story for another time. Klamath Lake, Oregon, May 9th, 1846. In the middle of the night, a group of mountain men lie in much-deserved sleep after a hard day's travel of roughly 60 miles through the rugged terrain of southern Oregon. Their party, 14 strong, is composed of experienced mountain men from a variety of background. Included among them are 3 native Delaware tribesmen, as well as the French-descendant, St. Louis-born Basil Lajeunesse. They are led by John C. Fremont, a former U.S. Army cartographer who has, by means of both merit and a powerful father-in-law, managed to secure himself a congressional appointment to explore the American West. For the better part of the 1840s, he has conducted exploratory missions throughout the West. However, much of the territory he is exploring does not belong to the United States. It, in fact, belongs to Mexico. Though fur trappers, traders, sailors, and whalers have been finding their way to California by sea or by overland crossing for decades now, the territory of Northern California is still, at this point in 1846, relatively unknown and uninhabited. It is owned, ostensibly, by Mexico, as it had been owned by the Spanish before. But in reality, neither government has invested much in the way of resources towards settling the wild lands that lay to the north and to the east of the mission systems that hug the coastline. By and large, this area of Northern California and Oregon is, in fact, under the control of the tribes who have long ruled their respective areas of domain from the San Joaquin Valley to the Cascade Mountains. This meant that the ruling government's headquarters, thousands of miles away in Mexico City, was of little to no use to the Mexican citizens inhabiting the area. However, the land was bountiful, and, at a time when the population was scarcely more than a few thousand people in Northern California, plentiful and ready for the taking by any settler with means and intentions to do so. As was the case in Texas a decade earlier, this openness and availability has drawn a fair amount of American farmers, ranchers, and entrepreneurs. The lack of regulation from the Mexican government provides an enticing prospect for those who have, as of yet, been unable to secure a plot of land and sustain a livelihood elsewhere. The vast, open swaths of ungoverned and unsettled territory also draws the interest of the United States government. Since the expedition of Lewis and Clark 4 decades earlier, the national adherence to the doctrine of manifest destiny has become increasingly vociferous. As the desire for a continent-spanning nation has become more and more apparent amongst the voting public, and the outcry for greater settlement begins to trickle in from Americans living in Northern California, President John Tyler, and then his successor James K. Polk, begin to take increasing interest in wresting the territory from Mexico. But first, the United States must have a better understanding of the territory they hope to overtake and annex. Thus, the services of John C. Fremont have been enlisted on a number of exploratory jaunts that have seen the inveterate, well-connected explorer cover vast swaths of the Rockies and Sierra Nevadas, not to mention numerous trips through deserts and to the Pacific coastline. Fremont now finds himself here, on the shoreline of the vast Klamath Lake, on yet another excursion being undertaken under the decidedly odd pretense of exploring a country that is not his to explore. Now, it seems another layer is being added to this mission by James K. Polk himself. In the week prior, Fremont's company had been surprised on the trail by a hurried, breathless U.S. Marine lieutenant named Archibald Gillespie. Lieutenant Gillespie had appeared seemingly out of nowhere, materializing from amidst the hulking redwoods like a travel-weary specter. Though his presence seems a curious novelty to most of these men, he brings news of great import for Fremont. Gillespie has been dispatched by President James K. Polk himself, with messages for the American consuls in Los Angeles as well as for John Fremont. After making his way from Washington, D.C. to Mexico and then taking a ship to Los Angeles, Gillespie was informed that Fremont's expedition was on its way north, hundreds of miles ahead of him. Gillespie had made an incredible effort through environments that his training as a Marine in the 1830s had not prepared him for in order to catch up to Fremont and Company and deliver the secret messages. What the messages say will be lost to history, but it is thought to concern Fremont's involvement in the coming efforts to annex California for the United States. The men in Fremont's company are unsure of the exact nature of the correspondence, but are sure that they now find their leader in a fitfully distracted state. He had conferred with Gillespie late into the night as he pored over the letters. He had been so assured of their safety and so ensconced in his new business at hand with Gillespie that Fremont had given all the men license to sleep freely, without posting a guard. While many in the party had seen this as a welcome relief, one man does not. His name is Christopher Houston Carson, otherwise known as Kit Carson. At 37 years old, he is not only a legendary mountain man, but has become an inadvertent pop culture figure. All across the eastern seaboard and the big cities of New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C., men, women, and children alike delighted in reading the dime novels replete with highly fictionalized accounts of his daring and expertise. Though Carson is the first to dispel any notion of his own celebrity, his renown is certainly not without cause. He has seen more of the continent than almost any man living at this time. He has traded, fought, and even married into local tribes on the Great Plains and in the vast Southwest. He has survived all manner of privation, hardship, and danger for over 2 decades in locales from the Rocky Mountains to the city of Los Angeles to the sun-drenched prairies of Kansas. He has spent over a decade as a mountain man in the company of legendary trappers such as Bill Williams, Jim Bridger, and Ewing Young. He had married an Arapaho woman named Singing Grass, and the couple had had 2 children. However, in 1839, Singing Grass had died of complications during labor, leaving Carson to care for 2 young daughters. He had remarried to a Cheyenne woman named Making Out Road, but the marriage had ended quickly in divorce, and his children had not been welcome. In April of 1842, after his youngest daughter, whose name is unknown, was killed in a tragic accident after falling into a vat of boiling soap, Carson had decided to bring his surviving daughter to Missouri to stay with relatives. While on a steamboat on the Missouri River, he was recognized by John C. Fremont, who engaged the vaunted frontiersman in conversation and convinced him to sign on as a guide for his new scientific expedition. Carson soon found himself again headed west, providing navigation and direction for Fremont's party. Over the course of the next few years, the 2 men and their small company would traverse vast expanses of the American West. By 1846, they have already made 2 expeditions and accumulated thousands of miles. By all accounts, Carson has been time and again, the party's saving grace from certain disaster. However, Carson, despite his notoriety and confidence in his own skills, is a man keenly aware of his own limitations. He is a man from a poor family, and for all intents and purposes, illiterate. His natural inclination, despite his authority and experience and aptitude, is to defer the burden of leadership to the wealthy, well-connected, and well-educated Fremont. So, earlier in this evening, as the men had eaten dinner and prepared their beds, Carson had dutifully obliged to Fremont's decision not to post a guard for the evening. But as much as Carson's mind had prevented him from verbalizing his concerns to his boss, his nerves, acclimated to constant sensitivity from a life spent on the trail, will not let him sleep soundly. Carson feels assured that the party is indeed vulnerable to attack. In the weeks prior to their arrival at Klamath Lake, Fremont, Carson, and company had been involved in a number of skirmishes with natives throughout the Northern California area. The most notable of these being the Wintu Massacre, also known as the Sacramento River Massacre. In late March of 1846, the Fremont party had arrived at the Lassen Ranch in the northern Sacramento Valley, only to be informed by settlers that they believed a native attack upon them was imminent. Taking them at their word, and eager to seize an opportunity to both pad his military record as well as to instill some measure of intimidation into the surrounding natives, Fremont headed out in search of the native forces said to be amassing nearby. Under his charge were 60 Americans, including the trappers in his party, as well as, quote, 9 Delaware Indians, 2 California Indians, and 5 members of a nearby trading post. On April 5th, they had come upon a large camp of the Wintu people. Though this was indeed a large settlement, there was no indication that the people within were in the process of marshaling any sort of assault upon the settlers in the area. However, Fremont saw their sheer number and presence in the area as sufficient cause to order an attack. The village was set upon from 3 sides by the forces under Fremont's command. Thomas Breckinridge, a member of Fremont's exploratory party and present at the incident, gave the following account. The order was given to ask no quarter and to give none. The settlers charged into the village, taking the warriors by surprise, and then commenced a scene of slaughter which is unequaled in the West. The bucks, squaws, and papooses were shot down like sheep, and those men never stopped as long as they could find one alive. Estimates of the number of Wintu people killed in the attack range from 150 to 700, with many drowning or being shot as they fled into the river. Word had spread quickly among all tribes of Northern California and Oregon of the great massacre inflicted upon the native people, perpetrated by the dark-haired, long-bearded officer and his party of mountain men. Though seemingly untroubled by the butchery, as he had so often been privy to in his life on the frontier, Carson is all too keenly aware of the potential consequences such actions might incur. Sometime after midnight, his wire-tight nerves snapped Carson out of his shallow slumber. Amidst the lapping of waves on the lake shore, the crackling of coals in the campfire, and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees, an odd, dull thumping noise causes his eyes to snap open, and immediately surveil the campsite. With only the light of the campfire to illuminate the scene, Carson can at first find nothing amiss. Then his eyes settle on the oddly contorted position in which his good friend Basil La Jeunesse is sleeping. "What's the matter over there, Basil?" Carson inquires. Then he notices an odd glistening of the firelight off La Jeunesse's head and torso. Within seconds, the situation is clear to the experienced mountain man. His friend has been killed, bludgeoned by a native warrior's club, and the camp is under attack. Carson, the first in the camp to awake to this horror, calls out, "Indians!" and fires his pistol into the darkness. As Carson's cry is still echoing off the trees surrounding them, the other men are awakened. Lucian Maxwell, Alex Godey, and Dick Owens, all longtime friends and compatriots of Carson's, now have their pistols and tomahawks drawn, eyes searching the night, seeking any kind of available cover. Arrows whistle by them, thudding into the tree trunks as dark figures whirl about just outside the light of the fire. A Delaware tracker known as Crane grabs a rifle and attempts to fire into the darkness, but it is either unloaded or misfires. As a few attacking warriors dash through the camp, Crane attempts to club them with his now otherwise useless firearm. In his fury, he becomes unaware of his position in front of the fire, making him a well-illuminated target for his attackers. Moments after being exposed by the light of the fire, Crane's torso is filled with arrows, and he falls dead. As Carson's eyes sweep the campsite, he hears a loud, guttural moan from his right. Looking over his shoulder, he sees the motionless body of Denny, his good friend and a much-beloved Delaware tracker. Turning his attention again towards the center of the camp, hoping to catch some of the attacking warriors in the same firelight that had doomed the Delaware Crane, Carson sees a lone warrior. Resplendent in full war paint and headdress, standing his ground in the middle of the camp, fighting with unabashed fury. With a fine steel tomahawk, he cuts and slashes at the camp defenders, exhorting the other attackers with his war cries. Carson presumes this to be the chief, as do the other experienced mountain men in the party. The next volley of shots from their rifles and pistols renders the attacking chief no more, as he too falls next to the flickering campfire. For the bulk of the next hour, the attacking warriors make repeated, though seemingly haphazard, attacks upon the campsite, hoping to reclaim the body of their fallen leader. Eventually, the attacks abate, and the survivors spend the next few hours in a pensive state, waiting for another assault to materialize from the darkness. Finally, the sun begins to peek over the craggy mountains surrounding the lake. Some of the men set about laying blankets over the bodies of Denny, Crane, and La Jeunesse as Carson and Fremont examine the fallen chief. He is, Carson is sure, a Klamath, a people he has derided before as a mean, low-life, and treacherous race. The chief, now cold in death, his ornate war bonnet crumpled by his last fall, is covered in jagged designs of bright war paint. Carson would later recall him to be the bravest Indian I ever saw. But in this moment, as his comrades lie strewn in death on the ground around him, Carson is overcome with an unconquerable mix of grief and rage. As his eyes blur and his nostrils flare, he deliberately takes the tomahawk, secured to the chief's wrist with a leather thong, from its owner. For a few moments, Carson examines the weapon with the curiosity and awe of a seasoned cultural anthropologist. The weapon is heavy-headed, but well-balanced, the handle sitting nicely in the palm, and its blade razor-sharp. Then, in a sudden torrent of rage that shocks Fremont and the newcomer Gillespie, Carson raises the weapon up and powerfully, repeatedly, smashes it into the face and head of the fallen chief. Again and again, the blows rain down, until the chief's head is, by Carson's later estimation, all knocked to pieces. When his grief is momentarily satiated, Carson confers with Fremont as to the next course of action. Revenge, both agree, must be the order of the day. First, though, there is the business of burying their comrades. The 3 dead men are wrapped in blankets and strapped sideways onto their horses. Fremont and Carson initially planned to bury their friends at a scenic spot on the lake shore. However, as they travel in search of a suitable location, the bodies of the dead men are repeatedly bludgeoned and knocked off of their mounts by the numerous trees that obfuscate any clear path through the territory. Soon, the bodies are bruised, and the task becomes so distasteful that the company of men decide that their unfortunate cohorts must be buried on the spot, in the cold, rocky soil of the forest. As a few of the men stand guard, the remainder claw at the ground with their knives, eventually digging out a singular, shallow grave big enough for 3. The men are buried with little ceremony but the prayers of their comrades, and covered with logs and rocks in order to ward off predators. With their comrades now buried, the men's grief and rage runs unfettered. Their first order of business now is to find any Klamath that they can and exact retribution upon them. Their Delaware scouts, after completing their own burial rituals for their fallen comrades, are the first to head out into the silent labyrinth of trees in search of any lingering Klamath. They are gone only a short time when they reappear, this time each holding a freshly taken scalp. "Was sick, better now," one said. The Delaware, Carson, and a small group then head up the Klamath Lake shoreline, scouting for a larger village. About 10 miles ahead of Fremont and the remainder of the men, Carson and the company stumble upon a large village of Klamath. They, too, are quickly spotted by the Klamath, whose women and children scatter in all directions as the men in the village race to arm themselves, and those who had been out fishing hurriedly beach their canoes in a rush to reach their weapons and fellow defenders. With the element of surprise lost, Carson and his men must now make an immediate attack, which they do, with another massacre ensuing. Though accounts vary, with Carson insisting that no women or children were killed, at least one old woman was found among the dead. The huts of the villages are set ablaze, which Carson deems a beautiful sight to behold. As smoke and flames engulf the village, Fremont, disappointed to have missed out on the action, gallops into the camp with the rest of his men. Though he has been unable to catch up to Carson in time for the attack, it will be only a matter of hours until Fremont can claim a coup of his own. As Carson is surveying the destruction wrought by his small attacking band on this, the largest Klamath village in the area, a lone warrior returns and, seeing what has occurred in his absence, draws an arrow aimed directly at Carson. The sudden motion catches Carson's eye, and he draws his pistol and squeezes the trigger, but the weapon misfires. Fremont, a few yards away, spots the Klamath taking aim and spurs his powerful gray warhorse, Sacramento, at the man, trampling him under hoof. The lone Klamath is then pounced upon by a Delaware named Segunde and bludgeoned to death with a war club. Though Carson's allegiance to Fremont has thus far been unwavering, this incident will forever instill an unflagging obedience to the Army officer that will carry on for the rest of Carson's life. Now, as the Klamath village lies in destruction, with Klamath warriors strewn about the ground in their final repose, Carson again confers with Fremont as to their next move. He is informed that they must now, with the advent of the information brought in the top-secret letters by the Marine Archibald Gillespie, return to California. There is a rebellion on against the Mexican government, and Fremont, Carson, and company will all play a pivotal role. The party heads south, leaving the Klamath village to burn and the survivors to mourn. The village is never rebuilt, and the survivors scatter to other bands. Though they have been held accountable by Fremont and Carson for the deaths of their friends, many experts today believe that the Klamath had, in fact, been innocent of any involvement in the attack on the Americans' camp. Instead, it is now believed that the offending tribe had been the Modoc, a culturally related but longtime enemy of the Klamath people. It does not seem that Carson was terribly concerned with the deeds of himself and his men that day as, in his later account, he would deem it a perfect butchery. Carson, though, already a famous figure, will go on to cement his legend in the coming decades, as will Fremont. Few figures in American history have been as consequential as these two men, and their deeds will, for better or worse, carry great weight for years well after their deaths. The stories of exploration, navigation, adventure, survival, combat, and killing seem almost too numerous to tell, and though rest assured, history at the OK Corral will do our best to tell them all, for tonight, they are other stories for other times.
In 2015, The Revenant, starring Leonardo DiCaprio and directed by Alejandro G. Inarritu, was released to great critical acclaim and box office success. In 2016, the film would see great success at all major award shows, most notably netting 3 Academy Awards. But The Revenant lied, or at least wildly misled you. Hugh Glass was indeed a legendary mountain man, and he was indeed attacked by a grizzly and left for dead in 1823, and he did indeed complete a harrowing journey that deservedly has gone down in Western lore as one of the all-time tales of survival. But he had no native wife, nor any native nor adopted children, and he did not exact revenge on the companions who left him, nor did his legendary career end where the movie does. Hugh Glass would ultimately forgive his betrayers and return to the unknown wilds he loved so dearly. And ultimately, he would die a hard death at the hands of his enemies, many miles from all he knew and loved. Glass's biography is replete with obfuscation and confusion, with some evidence pointing to his being born in Pennsylvania and some pointing to him being born in Ireland. Either way, he is said to have taken to the high seas and served as a sailor and possibly a pirate for a time, ultimately jumping ship in the Gulf of Mexico to escape being the prisoner of the notorious pirate John Lafitte. He swam to shore in Texas and made his way north, ultimately signing on with the trapping expedition and beginning his career as a mountain man. He survived numerous attacks from native tribes, served alongside other legendary mountain men such as Jedediah Smith and William Ashley, to name just a few, and even penned a moving letter to a fellow trapper's family after the man passed away in a fight depicted between the Arikara and the mountain men in the opening scenes of the movie. After being mauled by the grizzly, Glass would indeed be abandoned by William Fitzpatrick and a teenage Jim Bridger. Glass would indeed essentially crawl hundreds of miles, surviving off of roots and buffalo carcasses to get to the nearest fort. He would then indeed pursue Bridger, but only to scare him and basically call him a little jerk. And Bridger would go on to be one of the most legendary mountain men of all time. Fitzpatrick had joined the army, and while Glass did indeed track him down in order to retrieve his rifle and money, which he was given, Fitzpatrick's commanding officer empathetically but emphatically informed Glass that he would not be able to offer him any further retribution, as now Fitzpatrick was property of the U.S. Army. So there was no climactic encounter in which Glass and Fitzpatrick had a to-the-death knife fight until Glass could kill Fitzpatrick and thus secure his vengeance. It's an unfortunate liberty to take with this story, to be sure, as it completely changes its trajectory from what it really was. Ultimately, it was a story of forgiveness and a moving on with one's life, and it was turned into a simple story of satisfying a lust for revenge. But I digress. The movie shows Glass enduring another attack or two, mostly at the hands of the Arikara, but in reality, he had signed on with another fur company, survived being attacked by another group of natives, been shot in the back with 2 arrows, and made another harrowing journey to return to the nearest fort, from which he recovered and managed to carry on again. He headed to Santa Fe, New Mexico, where the Gila River was proving to be a hotspot for trappers at the time. Hugh Glass returned to trapping, guiding, and serving as a hunter for the U.S. military commanders in the area who needed meat for their men. Glass proved to be quite adept as a scout and hunter for the U.S. Army outfits who were, by and large, hapless in this new territory that they had little to no first-hand knowledge of. Hugh signed on for a job as a hunter for Fort Cass, a fort near the junction of the Yellowstone River and the Bighorn Rivers. He worked through the winter, but in the early spring of 1833 decided it might be a good time to try trapping the Yellowstone River. Hugh and 2 of his trapper cohorts from the fort, a man named Hilone Leonard and a man named Colin Rose, headed out to head down the river. However, the river was still largely frozen, and thus they had to make their way along the banks, looking for open spots to set their traps. They had not gone more than a few miles when they were ambushed from behind by a group of Arikaras. With no way to retreat away from the river, Glass, Leonard, and Rose quickly came to the sickening realization that the only possible direction in which to flee would be across the coverless expanse of the frozen river. They must have known their chances were next to non-existent, but all 3 chose to sell their lives as dearly as possible, doing their utmost to flee across the river. In what order they fell, we have no record. Whether they cried out in pain or died instantly, we will never know. But neither Hugh Glass nor his compatriots would make it across the frozen river on that chilly spring day. They would all be mutilated as a message to their friends that found them, and scalped. It was noted that the Crow tribe, amongst whom Glass had spent much time and become very well acquainted, accompanied Beckworth on a burial detail. His account, considered less than wholly reliable but not necessarily entirely apocryphal, is as follows. The crying was truly appalling. The 3 men were well known and highly esteemed by the Crows. When their bodies were lowered to their last resting place, numberless fingers were voluntarily chopped off and thrown into the graves. Hair and trinkets of every description were also contributed, and the graves were finally filled up. A few weeks later, a group of trappers came across the group of Arikara who had attacked Glass and his comrades. This group of Arikara claimed to the trappers to be Crow, who the trappers were friendly with, but the trappers noticed that these Crow were in the possession of some of Glass's effects, namely his rifle and his knife. When they found out that this group were actually Arikara, masquerading as Crows, in order to evade the trouble from this much larger force of Glass's countrymen, they became enraged. Johnson Gardner, the leader of the party of trappers, had the Arikara present tied up, scalped alive, and then thrown into a fire to wriggle like worms until they expired in the flames. Weeks later, it must be noted, Gardner would suffer the same fate at the hands of avenging Arikaras. And so the West went, one giant cycle of lives lost and legends built, only to be forgotten again, like so many winters past, in this unforgiving land. Hugh Glass's life was indeed awe-inspiring, and his legacy inarguable. What history remembers him for is a singular instance of his unimaginably staunch resolve to survive overwhelming circumstances that would have surely, and often did, doom lesser men. Glass would die as he lived, a man of action. And while the stories of his exploits remain innumerable, those are stories for another time. July 14th, 1828, southwestern Oregon. As the initial rays of sunlight struggled their way through the dense forest canopy in vaporous morning fog, finally reflecting on the rippling waters of the Umpqua River, a group of 4 men prepared to cast off in their dugout canoe. Their intention is to find a more passable route of travel rather than the circuitous, marshy path they had found themselves on in the last few days. 3 of the men are part of a 15 to 20 person band of fur trappers making their way north to Fort Vancouver in hopes of trading some of the fruits of their labors for some much-needed supplies, horses, and a respite from the omnipresent threats presented by the wilds of the Pacific Northwest. For them, the conditions presented by their current environs are at once shakingly unfamiliar and tranquilizingly routine. They had been making their way across the American West for the better part of 2 years, from St. Louis, across the Salt Lake Desert, the Mojave Desert, over the Sierra Nevadas, and up from Southern California to Northern California, and then on to Oregon. They had seen all manner of hardships along the way, from grizzly attacks to hostile Mexican government officials to attacks from hostile native tribes. Less than a year earlier, some of these men had been among the few survivors to emerge from an attack by the Mojave tribe in the austere, Joshua tree-strewn desert that bears their name. They hailed from all manners of backgrounds and ethnicities, though most were American Protestants from states like Pennsylvania, Virginia, Ohio, and New York. Though their diversity in culture and experience makes their collective categorization all but impossible, it is safe to say that none among them had seen wilderness like what they had encountered in the previous few weeks. They had made their way up from the San Joaquin Valley in central California, northwest through giant redwoods to the northern California coast. They had hung close to the coastline, staying as close to the water as possible during the low tide and moving back up toward the timber as the water level necessitated. As they made their way north, they found the terrain and the native tribes less and less hospitable. The 4th man in their crew, though, felt right at home as they paddled up the frigid river lined with Oregon white oaks. He was a member of the Umpqua tribe, an umbrella group of several smaller subgroups, all of which had resided here in the Umpqua Valley for generations. Specifically, he was a member of the Lower Umpqua Band. The etymology of the word Umpqua is thought to trace back to a word from their neighbors to the south, the Tolowa tribe. It is theorized to mean a place along the river, or thundering water, or dancing water, or bring across the river. They spoke the Siuslaw language, lived in cedar plank houses, and survived by both hunting and fishing in forests, streams, and ocean inlets in their home territory. They were also, like most tribes in North America at this point, increasingly impacted and influenced by the encroachment of Europeans and North Americans in their homelands. Like most tribes along the northern California and southern Oregon coastal ranges, the Umpqua were not averse to violent retaliation in response to trespassing in their territory. But they were not averse to making their lives easier either. However masterful the Umpqua, and for that matter any native tribe, may have been as woodsmen, life for them was still incredibly difficult. Not only was hunting made easier with firearms, but cleaning and dressing the animal were often easier with steel knives than with stone tools. Falling trees and splitting firewood was a far less laborious task when using a steel axe obtained from the whites. Though beads made from seashells and bones were indeed beautiful, the glass beads from the European and American traders could be garnered in a wider array of colors and a far greater quantity. Medicines, foodstuffs, blankets, fabrics, and gunsmithing services were all highly valued goods and services that most tribes could procure through few, if any, other sources than via trading with the whites. This led to an unavoidable mixing of cultures and a variety of cultural, economic, and military alliances. Though clashes were frequent throughout the West, as had been the case for the trapping party in the preceding weeks, the prevailing rule was that the enemy of one's enemy was one's friend. Many in the modern world often create a fundamental false binary of simply whites versus natives, when this does a fundamental disservice to both groups. The native tribes from Alaska to Argentina lived in harsh, conflict-ridden worlds in which life was a constant struggle for resources and safety. Just as in the modern world, pragmatism often won out over cultural purity in the interest of survival. Though this party of mountain men were clearly and presently trespassers in Umpqua territory, they could perhaps serve more utility as allies than enemies, or so the Umpqua had initially thought. And, for their part, nothing would have made the mountain men happier. Though many among them were certainly partial to the ardent nationalism of the early 19th century, almost all were cultural and economic pragmatists, first and foremost. Their goal was not to acquire territory, nor to entice the native tribes into a fight. Quite the contrary, their endeavors were essentially purely economic in nature, and thus many mountain men prided themselves on their ability to navigate the turbulent waters between such wildly different cultures. This was especially true for the leader of this party, the young but already legendary Jedediah Strong Smith. Though he was only 29 years old, he had already spent a decade of his life in the wilds of the American West. He had been born in 1799 in what is today Bainbridge, New York, to Jedediah Smith Sr. and Sally Strong, longtime New Englanders of staunch, puritanical stock. The family moved to Erie County, Pennsylvania when Smith was still a boy, and by age 13, his innate thirst for adventure led him to find a job as a clerk on a Lake Erie freighter. Here, he came across a number of frontiersmen and fur trappers, many under the employ of the Hudson Bay Company. Thoroughly regaled with tales of daring, adventure, and riches had from capitalizing on Europe's obsessive demand for New World furs, Smith set out for St. Louis at the age of 17, and by 1822, census information shows him living in the burgeoning, though doubtless still austere, frontier city. Here, his hopes of obtaining employment with a fur company expedition were realized when he, along with 99 other adventure-hungry young men, answered a newspaper ad in the Missouri Gazette. The ad was posted by General William H. Ashley, another eventually legendary figure in the history of the mountain men and fur trade in the American West. General Ashley called for 100 enterprising young men to head northwest to the Rockies in search of beaver pelts that were used to make the hats now so in vogue in London taverns and Paris cafes. In the spring of 1823, the company, known to history as Ashley's 100, left St. Louis, and Jedediah left his old life behind forever. He had risen quickly through the loose commandatory hierarchy of the fur trapping companies, comporting himself with courage and composition time and again under the duress of frustration, starvation, thirst, and combat. He had seen countless close friends die in violent ways, endured seemingly endless travel and privation, and seen his boyish good looks scarred forever after narrowly surviving an attack from a grizzly bear. Through it all, Smith had been noted for his moderation, his piety, his reliability, and his skill as a woodsman, marksman, and trapper. Now, though, as he found himself seated in a canoe next to his Umpqua guide and trapper compatriots, Jed Smith was tired. He had come thousands of miles, seen so much, and yet still had not managed to acquire the financial success he had hoped to nearly a decade ago. As the iridescently haunting rays of sunlight began to poke more and more holes in the forest canopy, one can imagine the deep sense of fatigue that must have set in as Smith surmised his current situation in its totality. He and his men were all travel-weary, within striking distance of starvation, and summarily weakened in both body and mind. The preceding days had been worryingly turbulent, and they must have weighed heavily on his mind. He and his men had encountered the Umpqua a few days earlier in a trade meeting that encapsulated the terse, uncertain, and all too human nature of Native and Euro-American interactions spanning from the 1400s to the 21st century. Having spotted some Umpqua sentries at a distance, Smith and his party made signs to parley and initiate trade in hopes of both restoring their supplies and building an amicable relationship. Unlike their Spanish predecessors and American successors, this party of trappers hoped not to conquer or colonize, but merely to peacefully pass through on their way to Fort Vancouver. Even the most ardent extoller of the virtues of manifest destiny among them would concede that now, with a party of not quite 24 objectively overworked and severely undernourished trappers, was not the time nor the place to attempt a conquest of any kind. The Umpqua, who at this point in history rarely saw any white men, were simultaneously wary, curious, and confused. And given even a cursory glance at the territorial geopolitics all along the western coast at the time, but specifically in California and Oregon, it is quite understandable why. Though California had long been ostensibly under the control of the Spanish, the English and the Russians had, at this point, spent decades making forays into the ocean inlets and mountainscapes of the Pacific Northwest in hopes of laying claim to its innumerable resources in both flora and fauna. Private interests such as the Hudson Bay Company had also spent small fortunes on incursions deep into the unknowns of the region in hopes of establishing networks of native tribes and collecting intelligence on any potential natural boundaries to be had. In the Treaty of 1818, the United States and Britain, awash in the geocentric hubris of the time, agreed to share exploratory custody of a territory that was not theirs to begin with. Regardless, in the intervening decades, the Umpqua and their neighbors had seen a marked increase in the frequency and size of the expeditionary parties making their incursions into the territory. They had been intermittently accepting of and hostile to such incursions, but in recent months had warmed to the idea of building amicable relations with white traders in hopes of fortifying their own wealth. Jedediah Smith and his party had hoped to capitalize on this, though their interactions with the Umpqua's neighbors to the south had been terse at best and violent at worst up until now. However, seeing the only prudent course of action as taking the most amicable route, Smith intended to make some good trades and build at least some usable amount of rapport with their reluctant, suspicious hosts. The two parties had convened at the mountain men's camp on the west side of the bend in the river. At first, the mood was suspicious. However, after some initial offers and counteroffers, both sides began to relax, and a sense of reserved joviality seemed to prevail. Then, one of the men informed Jedediah Smith that an axe and a skinning knife had gone missing from the party's supplies. It was apparent that, if one of the trappers had not taken the missing items, one of the Umpqua had. Though known for his magnanimity and charity in such situations, Smith had learned through the incessant native thievery that had plagued his party since the Dakotas that no amount of charity would render the goods returned. And so he saw fit to employ more forceful measures. The suspected Umpqua was detained by Smith and two others, tied up and interrogated as to the whereabouts of the axe and knife. For hours, the suspected Umpqua denied any and all knowledge of the missing items. Interestingly though, even during this time, trading continued amongst a number of smaller parties in which the hungry trappers bartered for shellfish and berries the Umpqua had brought to trade. Finally though, The axe was found amongst the detained Umpqua's effects, though the knife never was, and he was free. Though he was indeed guilty of the theft, this particular Umpqua was a chief amongst his people, and now felt much aggrieved at his treatment by these American interlopers. He retreated across the river and complained to his fellow chiefs, demanding some kind of retributory action be taken in defense of his honor. The most senior chief in the group dissuaded him from this pursuit, though, arguing that he had not been so egregiously assaulted as to merit the killing of the trappers. However, it would be only a short time later when that same chief, having re-engaged in trading with the trapping party, was himself offended. The two conflicting accounts of what happened next are as follows. In the Umpqua's recounting, the chief in question thought it would be greatly amusing to ride about the camp on one of the fine mounts in possession of the trappers. The trapper who owned the horse ordered him off at gunpoint, and a fight then and there was narrowly avoided. In the trapper's account, the chief was in no uncertain terms directed to dismount, but no kind of firearm was brandished. Despite the disparity in accounts, in either case, an immediate confrontation was avoided. The Umpqua met again across the river and decided that immediate retribution was still not the most prudent answer, and so the auspices of normality with the trappers should be maintained. Hence, the Umpqua who had agreed to guide Smith and his cohorts upriver agreed to stay at the campsite with them in order to leave the next morning. Before his companions left, though, plans were made for exacting the revenge the Umpquas felt to be rightfully theirs. Ostensible agreements were made to resume trading the next day, and the trappers fell into preparing their meals and readying themselves for a night's sleep. Jedediah Smith had his suspicions as to the Umpqua's intent, but could do little more than feign normality and carry on with the evening's tasks. With his small force against the several dozen Umpqua, here in the middle of nowhere, any attempt at an offensive attack would likely result in their small party being overrun. Though there is no record of it, Smith may have conferred with his more senior party members as to the most plausible courses of action. But no determined defensive plan was set in place, nor were the men notified of any suspected heightened threat. However, the next morning, as Smith and company warily paddled their canoe around a bend in the river and out of sight, many in the camp were still asleep. In the succeeding hour or so, many would wake up and begin their morning tasks of checking their equipment and procuring themselves some breakfast before setting about the more laborious tasks of their day. Smith, Leland, and Turner, along with their guide, carried out their intended mission of scouting out a more desirable route to travel. As they made their way back, they paddled with the vigor of men looking forward to a hearty breakfast after a hard morning's work. Then, just as they approached the bend in the river around which they had disappeared earlier that morning, they heard a riotous commotion coming from the camp, still hidden from view. As Smith, Leland, and Turner conferred with each other as to what the cause might be, the Umpqua guide snatched Smith's rifle and in one deft, intentional motion, tipped the canoe over, spilling them all into the river. The Umpqua swam to the western bank, while Smith, Leland, and Turner made it to the eastern bank, just in time to take cover from a volley of fire coming from a hidden group of Umpquas their former canoe mate had swum to for cover. They made their way to the top of a low promontory overlooking their campsite from across the river, and were greeted with a scene that must have haunted their nightmares for the remainder of their lives. All of the men in camp were now dead. Only minutes before their arrival, as their friends and comrades were still waking, a force of 200 Umpqua had overrun the camp. Some of the men had been cooking breakfast, some cleaning their weapons, and some were still asleep in their blankets when they were fell upon and cut down in a matter of minutes by Umpqua war clubs, hatchets, and arrows. Smith and company could only watch on as the aftermath unfolded, in which all of their belongings, including furs they had worked 2 years in acquiring, were either stolen or destroyed. Their livestock milled about nervously, made skittish by the sudden commotion and iron scent of blood. Eventually, they too were taken by the Umpqua. One man, Moses Black, had managed to dive into the river and escape his pursuers. According to his later account, he had been cleaning his rifle when 2 Umpqua appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, and demanded he relinquish his weapon to them. Black had refused, and after a short tussle, he had turned and ran after being slashed across the back by the Umpqua's knives. He had managed to jump into the river and avoid the arrows and rocks that rained down around him, making it to the eastern bank of the river and escaping. On his flight to the river, he had seen Thomas Virgin being hacked to pieces by a pair of Umpqua warriors, and another trapper, whom he believed to be Thomas Dawes, being chased down by a group of Umpqua in a canoe. Smith, Leland, and Turner, however, had no knowledge of Black's escape, and thus both parties, Smith and company as well as Moses Black, believed themselves to be the sole survivors of the massacre. However, regardless of their communication breakdown, the only viable destination for any trapper lost in that hostile country was to make their way north, as the party had originally intended, to Fort Vancouver. A tortuous hike of roughly 200 miles up rocky shoreline and through unforgiving woodlands that would be incredibly taxing for even fit, well-fed individuals. It would not be until August 8th that Moses Black would struggle to the gates of Fort Vancouver. He was half dead and being nearly carried by a kindly Tillamook native who had taken it upon himself to guide the starving, desperate man to his destination. At first, Black could not bring himself to speak, so shaken were his nerves. The commander of the fort ordered the gates opened and for the clearly traumatized man to be brought in and cared for. After being wrapped in blankets and given a warm drink, Black was able to still his nerves long enough to articulate the horrors of his plight. A retributive excursion was immediately planned by the fort's commander, Captain John McLaughlin. Runners were sent out to the surrounding tribes, notifying them that a handsome reward would be paid to any natives who brought in survivors of the recently perpetrated massacre. The next day at around noon, Smith, Leland, and Turner staggered to the gates of the fort, themselves in little better condition than Moses Black. They too had procured Tillamook guides after making their way roughly 120 miles up the coast. Though both Black and Smith's party were all thrilled to learn that they were not, in fact, the sole survivors of the massacre, their cross-referencing of accounts also confirmed the sad truth that there were no other survivors. This, as in so much of the history of the Old West, is also a matter of some dispute in differing accounts. Umpqua accounts speak of two native women who were traveling with the party and were left unharmed, even eventually marrying into the tribe. Though they were not mentioned in any of Smith's journal entries, nor in the accounts of his contemporaries, that does not mean the Umpqua accounts were untrue. It would not have been uncommon for parties of trappers to provide either employment or safe travel to local tribespeople as their comparatively sizable and well-armed contingent made their way through the territory. However, we do know that every single trapper present, other than Smith, Leland, Turner, and Black, was killed there at the campsite on the Umpqua River. Their names were Thomas Dawes, John Gaither, Abraham LaPlante, Emmanuel Lazarus, Touchant Marichal, Martin McCoy, Joseph Palmer, Peter Ranney, Harrison Rogers, Charles Swift, Thomas Virgin, a former slave known as Ranza, and perhaps most tragically, Marion, the Indian boy whom they had taken into their party, by some accounts forcefully, in order to provide him with either protection, use him for labor, or both. All died tragically violent, terrifying deaths under a dark forest canopy, thousands of miles from most of their homes. Smith left only two written accounts of the attack, one to his brother and another to William Clark. Both are relatively terse in nature, and though sorrow is undoubtedly expressed on Smith's behalf, the veneer of his imperturbability remained uncracked. Undoubtedly, though, Smith and the other survivors were all psychologically traumatized and burning for revenge. Smith was informed by a sympathetic Captain McLaughlin that all would be done within his power to restore what property he could of Smith's, but that marshaling an all-out assault on the Umpquas was highly imprudent and thus out of the question. Crestfallen and physically depleted, Smith, Black, Leland, and Turner would eventually recover enough to make their way southeast to the yearly Mountain Man rendezvous in present-day Wyoming. Smith would eventually make his way back to St. Louis, and after a short-lived retirement from the mountain man life, find himself on the Cimarron River in present-day Kansas. It would be here, in 1831, that Jedediah Smith, legendary mountain man, would meet his end at the hands of the dreaded Comanche. But that, like the plethora of other harrowing stories from Jed Smith's short but remarkable 32-year life, is another story for another time.
Labette County, Kansas, March 28, 1873. In the crisp spring air, riding across miles of open prairie, Colonel Alexander M. York is oblivious to the open grandeur of his surroundings. His brow is furrowed, and his mind is lost in a dark labyrinth of uncertainty and concern. Colonel York is a Civil War veteran and a member of the Kansas State Senate. He has seen much in his 35 years, but the events of the previous few weeks have truly unnerved him to his core. It had begun in January of that year in the town of Independence, Kansas, where Colonel York lived near his brother, Dr. William Henry York. The doctor, normally a composed and thoughtful man, had become increasingly concerned and agitated as the month dragged on. His close friend, neighbor, and former patient, a man named George Newton Longcore, as well as George's 2-year-old daughter, Mary Ann, had left the town of Independence to resettle in Iowa. Longcore had informed his family and friends of his travel plans and estimated time of arrival in Iowa, at which time he would send a letter informing them of his new location. But after several weeks, no word had arrived. Finally, in the early spring, Dr. York had gone out on his own in search of the now clearly missing father and daughter. Kansas in 1873 is still a dangerous place. With the war against the native tribes still ongoing, the threat of attack from tribes like the Comanche, Kiowa, Arapaho, Cheyenne, or Osage are still considered very real possibilities, though less and less likely as the years go by. The more palpable threat, many living in the area believe, comes from the bandits and thieves who propagate the open country between towns and farmsteads, preying on travelers and passers-by. The past 2 years in particular had seen a slew of unsolved killings and disappearances. In May of 1871, the body of a man identified only by the surname of Jones was found on Drum Creek, his head bludgeoned into disfigurement and his throat cut. In February of 1872, 2 more bodies were discovered, victims of the same wounds. Dr. York was well aware of the dangers, but found them preferable to the anguish that plagued him in not knowing the fate of his friend and the toddler Mary Ann, whom he had cared for as an infant and doted over for countless hours. He had made his way from town to town, inquiring as to whether or not any of the locals had seen Longcore and his daughter. After a long and fruitless search, the doctor had been making his way back home to Independence, Kansas. But he has not been seen since. Now, his brother, Colonel York, has just left Fort Scott, Kansas, in a desperate attempt to locate him. He has traced every inch of his medically inclined brother's trail, but has come up with nothing more than vague recollections and rumors from the locals. Within a few hours of riding, Colonel York reaches what is known as the Osage Township. The township amounts to little more than a few buildings and a general store, but upon inquiry, the colonel is informed that his brother had indeed been seen a few weeks earlier. He had purchased some cigars, the shopkeeper informs him, and had inquired as to where he might find a place to rest for the night. The shopkeeper had informed him of a place a few miles down the road, known as Wayside Inn. The doctor thanked the man for his help and rode off in the direction of the inn. Now, having garnered his new bit of intel, his brother follows the same road, headed for the Wayside Inn. However, when the colonel arrives at the Wayside Inn, he is nearly instantly unsettled by what he finds. The proprietors, a family known as the Benders, are an odd lot, even at first glance. There are 4 of them, all believed to be Dutch or German immigrants due to their heavy accents. They are all engaged in various activities about the homestead when Colonel York arrives. Busy with the daily chores of feeding animals and cleaning stalls is the patriarch, a wiry man in his mid-60s, known as John Bender or Pa Bender. He is a visibly gruff character who pays his visitor little more attention than a cursory wave and a contemptuous glare. Assisting him is his son, John Jr., a plain-looking young man in his late 20s or early 30s. John Jr. offers little more hospitality than his father. He is known amongst the locals for bursting out in laughing fits during inappropriate moments and for being socially off-putting in general. As he steps inside the ramshackle building, Colonel York sees a dark and dingy room divided in two by a large bedsheet hung in the middle of the room. Nearest the sheet is the dining table. Opposite the table is a small store stocked with barrels of apples, sacks of flour and cornmeal, coffee, and tobacco. Most of the inventory lies covered in a thin veneer of dust. Seated at the table, bearing the same demeanor and expression as her son and husband, is the taut-faced and mean-eyed Elvira, or Ma Bender. She merely waves York towards her daughter, who is in charge of checking in new guests. Her name is Kate Bender, and she alone amongst her family is well known and liked amongst the local residents. She is an attractive young lady in her early 20s with an inviting smile and a bubbly personality that seem to have sprouted inexplicably amidst the guile and anger of the rest of her family. Kate cheerily inquires as to how she might be of help to Colonel York, who explains his intent of finding his missing brother. He provides a description of the doctor and explains that this is one of the last locations that he is known to have been. Seemingly unfazed, Kate explains that they have not seen the missing man, but that the colonel is welcome to stay the night should he need a respite during his search. Colonel York replies that he would be much obliged for the night's shelter and a hot meal. At dinner time, as the rest of the clan stares dourfully at their plates, Kate engages the colonel in further conversation, inquiring as to his brother's other stops during his journey. She remarks that herself and her family, too, have been much concerned with all of the unexplained disappearances as of late, and proffers the theory that perhaps the local Osage tribe is to blame, as they have had a sizable score to settle with any whites in the territory. She and her family, she assures Colonel York, will do all that they can to assist in his search. Her brother, John Jr., then breaks his normally quiet affect and offers up an oddly out-of-pocket personal account, in which he claims to have been attacked by unidentifiable assailants on Drum Creek just a few weeks earlier. While he finds the contrast in family personalities to be odd, and John Jr.'s story to be oddly incredulous, the meal and the remainder of the evening unfold uneventfully, and the next morning, Colonel York departs. For the next few days, Colonel York inquires amongst other neighbors as to whether or not they have seen his brother. They say that they have not, but that they, in fact, suspect that Benders themselves have had something to do with the spate of recent disappearances. One neighbor claims that Ma Bender threatened her with a knife, claiming the woman had put a curse upon her coffee. Seeing this as just cause to further interrogate the Bender family, Colonel York recruits a small posse of local men to accompany him to the Wayside Inn. When they arrive, they are confronted by Ma Bender, who only doubles down on her accusations that the woman in question had put a curse upon her coffee. Colonel York and his group of incensed townsmen insist that the Benders have had something to do with the recent disappearances, and that one way or another they will be made to answer for them. In a desperate bid to defuse the situation, Kate Bender offers her services as a psychic and medium to commune with the missing doctor and assist in locating him. This bleeding edge of the Kansas frontier has recently become a popular home for a sizable population of spiritualists who believe themselves capable of communicating with the dead. Among the most prominent and skilled of these supposed clairvoyants is in fact Kate Bender. Seeing this as yet another shoddy ploy to evade justice, the colonel refuses. However, unable to find any outward evidence leading to the missing, Colonel York and party depart. Days after this, a community meeting is held at the Harmony Grove Schoolhouse, which includes about 100 local residents, among whom are Pa and John Bender Jr. At the meeting, the crowd agrees that search warrants will be obtained for every property in the county. One by one, every homestead in the surrounding area will be meticulously picked through until the bereaved and terrified townsfolk are able to obtain some answers on the whereabouts of their missing friends and family. In the days following the meeting, as the warrants are being written up, local rancher Billy Toll is moving a few head of cattle into town when he passes by the notorious Bender farm and the Wayside Inn. He notices the building to be oddly quiet, and the animals to be unfed and wandering about the property. Upon further inspection, it was found the entire farmstead and household had been abandoned. Missing were Pa Bender, Ma Bender, John Jr., Kate Bender, as well as the family mules and the wagon. Billy Toll rushed to inform the nearest neighbor, and soon word spreads to Colonel York. Colonel York and an even more sizable posse give chase, but manage only to find the Bender's wagon abandoned on the prairie. They return to the farmstead, where they are greeted with the unenviable task of examining the property in search of the bodies of those who had gone missing. In short order, they are greeted with a macabre scene that doubtless haunts their nightmares for the rest of their days. First, a trapdoor is found in the floor of the Bender home, underneath one of the beds. When it is opened, a sickening stench floods the room. An empty room sits under the bed, measuring roughly 6 feet deep and 7 feet wide. Its floor is thickly caked with dried blood, the source of the overwhelming stench. But no bodies are found here. Carrying their search outside, the men began to prod the ground with long iron rods in search of graves. Soon, a depression in the ground is discovered. After a brief stint of frantic digging, the horrified Colonel York and company discover the body of the unfortunate Dr. York, buried in a shallow grave, head down, with his boots only covered by a thin layer of dirt and rocks. The horrified party, now with proof in hand of the Bender's murderous deeds, carries on with their grisly task, finding another 8 bodies in other sites throughout the property. Among these unfortunate victims are George Longford and his young daughter, Mary Ann. All of the victims are found with a single blunt force injury to their heads and their throats cut. All, with the exception of Mary Ann, who was found with no such wounds and is believed to have been buried alive. In later interviews of those whom the Benders had decided not to kill, and after examining the layout of the room and murder weapons, the Benders' brutal method for dispatching their victims would be revealed. The potential prey would be invited inside to stay for dinner. During the meal, Kate would charm the guest in question and inquire as to their destination, their family, friends, and profession. If it was determined that the guest might be in possession of a sizable amount of cash, and that their disappearance could be blamed on local tribes or bandits, or might, better yet, go unnoticed entirely, Kate Bender would give the signal to Pa Bender, who would disappear behind the white sheet dividing the private quarters from that of the dining room and hotel. He would then grab an axe kept behind the sheet, and with a quick, sickeningly accurate strike, debilitate the unfortunate victim. Should this blow not kill them outright, their throats would be cut by either Ma Bender or Kate herself, just before tossing the body into the hidden room below to bleed out. The body would then be combed over for valuables and buried in a discreet location on the farm. To add to the horror of the investigators, more body parts were found than there were humans to attribute them to, meaning that the total death toll of the Benders' bloody reign in Kansas was likely much higher than would ever truly be known. While Colonel York will go on to serve in the Kansas Senate for years, living well into the 20th century, and the residents of Osage Township who assisted in unearthing the victims on the Bender farmstead eventually returned to their lives, the ultimate fate of the Bender family remains unknown. Some apocryphal tales find Pa Bender arrested many years later in Montana for murder, but in his efforts to escape, he amputates his own foot and subsequently perishes from loss of blood. By the time residents of Osage Township are able to examine the body, it is supposedly corrupted beyond recognition. Other accounts hold that John Jr. and Kate were in fact husband and wife, and that the pair disappeared into New Mexico, where they carried on their murderous deeds for years to come. However, no official record exists of any of the Bender family after their timely disappearance in that spring of 1873. The tales of their horrifying deeds soon spread worldwide and are featured in newspapers from New York to Paris. Though the West had always been a violent place, the notion of a family making it its business to murder and rob innocent passers-by was indeed a shocking one to most Americans and Europeans alike at the time. Though families such as the Harps had long horrified settlers in colonial America, and spree killers such as John Wesley Harding were soon to be household names, the idea of a singular person or small group carrying out a series of organized, methodical, and vicious killings was truly shocking to all but the most hardened sensibilities at the time. However, within just a few decades, with the advent of stories such as Austin, Texas's notorious servant girl annihilator and the shockingly evil murders carried out by H.H. Holmes in Chicago, the world at large, and America in particular, would be all too familiar with the advent of the serial killer. But for tonight, those tales, as well as the countless other accounts of brutality and inhumanity throughout the history of the Old West, are other stories for other times.
In the years 73 to 71 BC, as Spartacus led his band of rebels through the territory outside of Capua in the south of what is today Italy, the Roman legions were met with a challenge that their training had not prepared them for. The guerrilla tactics of Spartacus and his men wrought havoc on Roman legionnaires not just physically, but psychologically. This rebellion against the world's greatest power by a band of slaves turned gladiators who roamed the hillsides and struck without warning, struck terror into many a neophyte soldier's heart. And this terror began to eat away at the one thing that, in warfare, must be maintained at all cost: discipline. Legions began to break and run in battle, succumbing to their own terror rather than to be cut down at the hands of the rebels. The general in charge, Marcus Licinius Crassus, knew that this behavior could not be allowed to stand. So, he gathered up 500 of those who had fled. Those 500 were separated into groups of 10. In those groups, lots were drawn, with one unlucky man being singled out. He was then marched in front of his comrades, and his friends and cohorts with whom he had trained, traveled, dined, and fought, were then made to beat him to death with clubs. One can only imagine the scene as crying young men did their best to muster enough strength to swing their club as hard as possible and thus elicit as much mercy as they could in the situation, all while trying not to make eye contact with the man whose life they were ending, nor the other 8 men around them being forced to endure and exact the same trauma. The Romans were not the only culture to impose this practice, though they did give it its name: decimation, the decim being Latin for 10. Alexander the Great would use it, as would commanders well into the 20th century. But tonight, we're going to talk about when it was used by a famous Mexican general to punish a group of rebellious Texans. This is the story of the Black Bean Incident. Ciudad Mier, Mexico, December 27th, 1842. 60 Texans lay dead in the streets of the small town on the banks of the Rio Grande. 243 more had surrendered to the local commander Pedro de Ampudia, in hopes of avoiding the no-quarter policy that had been wrought against their countrymen at the Alamo 6 years earlier. They had hoped to exact retribution on the Mexican city and the people and soldiers present for what they called the Dawson Massacre, in which a few weeks prior, a number of Texans had been killed and taken prisoner by Mexican forces outside of the city of San Antonio de Bejar, today's San Antonio. Don't worry, the Dawson Massacre can and will have its own episode. On February 11th, 1843, 181 of the Texans escaped. However, by the end of the month, the lack of food and water in the mountainous Mexican desert resulted in 176 of them surrendering or being recaptured near Salado, Tamaulipas. Only 3 of the original escapees managed to make it back to Texas. They were made to continue their march southward until they reached Saltillo, Mexico. Here they were informed that the commander of the Mexican army, Santa Anna, was irate at their attempted flight and demanding that they be executed to a man. He was eventually talked down from the slaughtering of the Texans en masse and instead settled on subjecting the prisoners, who, not being part of an official government force, were not protected by the rules of war, to a sadistic game of chance. in which some would secure their lives and others would ensure their deaths. That game would be played on March 25, 1843. The commanding officer that day was Colonel Domingo Huerta. According to numerous first-hand accounts, a large clay jar was brought out. Huerta ordered the men assembled and that the large clay jar should be brought to the front of the formation. Into the jar were first placed 159 white beans. Then, 17 black beans were placed into the jar. The men were then informed that they would be made to draw beans from the jar, one man at a time. Anyone who drew a white bean would be allowed to live. Anyone who drew a black bean would be executed by firing squad. The officers were made to draw first, with a substantial number being among the unlucky. This is, by some, attributed to the order in which the beans were placed into the jar. It is asserted that, if this was the case, it would be meant to place the beans closer to the top and, in having the officers draw first, ensure that more of them would perish than their enlisted counterparts. Major James Decatur drew the first black bean. Unflinchingly resigned to his fate, he held the small legume up in between his thumb and forefinger and declared, "Boys, I told you so. I never failed in my life to draw a prize." He said the Mexicans were only robbing him of 40 years. One by one, as they opened their hands to reveal black beans, 16 more Texans came to the cold, hard realization that they would never see home again. They were William Mosby Eastland, Patrick Mahan, James M. Ogden, James N. Torrey, Martin Carroll Wing, John L. Cash, Robert Holmes Dunham, Edward E. Est, Robert Harris, Thomas L. Jones, Christopher Roberts, William N. Rowan, James L. Shepard, J. N. M. Thompson, James Turnbull, and Henry Walling. The men were all given pens and paper and a few minutes to write letters home and reconcile themselves with God. Then they were separated into two groups, one of 8 men, the other of 9 men. The first group was marched into the courtyard, blindfolded, and shot dead by a line of Mexican soldiers, with any not killed in the initial volley being finished off with a shot to the head by one of the officers present. The second group was marched in, lined up with the bodies of their comrades still warm and bleeding at their feet, and shot down themselves. James L. Shepard was shot and gravely wounded, but managed to play dead until the soldiers left the plaza. He slipped out into the night with a bullet lodged in his jaw, an arm that did not work, and no idea where to go or what to do. In the end, his suffering was only prolonged. He was found and shot dead by Mexican soldiers within a matter of hours. One officer, Captain Ewan Cameron, who had been a ringleader in the attempted escape, had escaped the firing squads by drawing a white bean. However, an entire month later, when Santa Anna found this out, he ordered Cameron pulled out of the ranks of prisoners and executed anyways. Fairness be damned. Cameron, a resolute Protestant as were essentially all Texans present, staunchly denied an offer to confess to a priest before his execution. Instead, he marched out, refused a blindfold, ripped open his shirt, and declared that he would die proudly for his beloved Texas. He was shot dead and buried at Perote Prison in Veracruz, Mexico. It would not be until September 16, 1844, after endless diplomatic besiegement, that Santa Anna would offer the release and return of the Texas prisoners. They were free now to go home, to leave the Mexican prison and return to their lives and families. And this they did, with many returning to Texas and resuming their lives as settlers, entrepreneurs, soldiers, lawmen, or some combination of the above. But their inclinations were not to forget, and their intentions were not to forgive. Their time as prisoners and their surviving of what history would come to know as the Black Bean Incident would shape their psyches. Many of the men who had survived, including Bigfoot Wallace and Samuel Walker, burned for revenge and suffered genuine trauma from the event. One can only imagine how many sleepless nights they endured, attempting to come to terms with their memories and to steel their resolve to exact retribution in due time. That time would come for these young men, who would go on to comprise a large bulk of the Ranger fighting force, and it would come soon. In 1847, the Mexican-American War would kick off, and the Texas Rangers would be drawn away from the hill country of Texas and into the dusty plains and jungled hills of central and northern Mexico. Here they would perpetrate some of the most terminal and resolute violence that had been seen anywhere before. But that is another story for another time.
British Columbia, Canada, June 16, 1811. Aboard the American fur ship known as the Tonquin, fur trader James Lewis lies below deck, mortally wounded. His breathing is labored, and he strains to listen to the native warriors that are just now pulling their long dugout canoes up next to the hulking vessel. He does not know their language, and thus he does not know what they are saying. But he knows why they are here, and James Lewis knows what is about to happen. The chilly waters that surround the vessel situated in Clayoquot Sound were seemingly empty just minutes ago. Now they seem to swarm with war canoes, dozens of them, filled with angered Clayoquot warriors. Soon, the plodding of moccasined footsteps begins to cause a low rumble, as if a thunderstorm is brewing somewhere far away. Lewis begins to feel sick, the noxious effects of his physical state and his psychological distress. But his resolve remains steady. His gaze drops momentarily, and he stares blankly into the room full of gunpowder kegs outside of which he lies, propped up against one of the sturdy wooden walls of the ship. He again studies the line of dark powder stretching from his position into the room. He is tired. The night before had been the longest of his still young life, in which his thoughts had drifted from his current situation to his family and friends at home, whom he knows he will never see again. He had also had much time to ponder the events of the previous few days, and just how he had come to be here, alone, below decks of this expensive and well-traveled ship. Lewis had been part of a crew of American, French, Canadian, and native fur traders under the employ of the legendary business and real estate mogul, John Jacob Astor. They had traveled to this distant locale in the hopes of trading with the natives for the valuable beaver pelts that were, at this time in the 19th century, a highly profitable commodity. For the next few days, they had anchored offshore of these idyllic lands and bartered a number of profitable trades with the locals. Though the men on board the Tonquin and the local Clayoquot had respective origins thousands of miles away from each other, they were well aware of each other's existence. Though America as a nation extends only to the Mississippi River at this point in the early 19th century, the American fur trade is a globalized industry. The fashionable beaver felt stovepipe hat at this time is all the rage in Europe, as well as the more cosmopolitan urban centers in America. Cafes, parlors, and street corners are all replete with young men sporting their most stylish new headgear. In what might be considered both the height of irony and a wonder of a worldwide supply chain, it is the fashionable fancies of the European upper classes that drive the day-to-day lives and livelihoods of people more than half a world away. Throughout the entirety of North America, fur trappers roam the rivers and streams, hoping to ensnare the valuable animals in their steel traps and send their bounties out to market by way of St. Louis or Santa Fe. And on the open seas, American vessels routinely made the treacherous journey around Cape Horn and up the west coast of North America to the Pacific Northwest, where they traded for furs with local natives. Within a few decades' time, the entire system would implode, as changing fashions and waning beaver populations would prove too much for the market to bear. However, in 1811, there is scarcely a more profitable trade on the whole of the continent, and men are driven to great lengths in their quests to build their fortunes. Perhaps most prominent among these men capitalizing on the fur boom is Johann Jakob Astor, better known as John Jacob Astor, a German-born American immigrant who had capitalized on the Jay Treaty that was signed by the United States and Great Britain in 1794. The treaty opened new markets in the Great Lakes region as well as in Canada, Astor signed a contract with the Northwest Company based in Montreal. Astor would import the furs from Montreal to New York, and then ship them to Europe to be purchased by hat manufacturers. By the turn of the 19th century, he had amassed a fortune of roughly $250,000, over $6 million by today's standards when accounting for inflation. However, in 1807, the U.S. Embargo Act was enacted by Congress, closing off trade with Canada and severely disrupting Astor's business dealings as his connections in Montreal were now illegal. In response, Astor obtained direct permission from President Thomas Jefferson to establish the American Fur Company, which he did in 1808. Over the next few years, Astor would use the American Fur Company, or AFC, as well as its subsidiaries, to gain control of virtually the entirety of the Great Lakes region, as well as secure several lucrative contracts. Intending to hamper his former employer in the Northwest Company, as well as the juggernaut of the industry in the Hudson's Bay Company, Astor soon began to finance expeditions to the Pacific Northwest in hopes of monopolizing the fur trade with the natives there before his rivals could gain a foothold. This had been the driving force behind Astor's purchase of the Tonquin. In 1810, Astor created the Pacific Fur Company, a subsidiary of the American Fur Company, to expand into the Northwest with intentions to both explore the territory and to establish favorable relations with the natives. Astor had purchased the Tonquin, a 290-pound bark, 96 feet in length, and outfitted to carry 22 cannons, from the Fanning and Coles Company, who had sailed the ship to China to trade for cheap goods in 1807. Astor purchased the vessel for $37,860, roughly $700,000 today, on August 23, 1810. He hired the most experienced fur traders he knew, mostly Scottish and French-Canadian voyageurs who had long plied their arduous trades amongst the natives of the Great Lakes region. And to command the ship, Astor sought out the services of a short-tempered and staunchly disciplined ex-U.S. Navy captain named Jonathan Thorn. Born in Schenectady, New York on January 8, 1779, he was the first of 15 children born to Samuel and Helena Horn. He became a midshipman in the U.S. Navy at age 21 in April of 1800. Thorn participated in the Tripolitan War, also known as the First Barbary War, in 1801. Thorn was part of a small group of volunteers that accomplished the dangerous mission of sneaking into the harbor at Tripoli, Libya, and destroying the captured American frigate known as the Philadelphia on February 16, 1804. On August 3rd of that same year, Thorn also participated in the attack on Tripoli Harbor led by Commodore Edward Preble. He was commended for his conduct during the engagement and was given command of one of the captured gunboats. While serving in the New York Navy Yard, he was promoted to the rank of full lieutenant in February 1807. At the time, Thorn was the youngest naval officer to ever command a United States naval yard. Still, despite his relatively rapid ascension within the ranks of the Navy, Thorn's correspondence to friends and family at the time betray a young man internally besieged by self-doubt and various physical ailments. Thorn would serve in the Navy until 1810, when he was granted a 2-year furlough in order to sign on with John Jacob Astor for a job as captain of the Tonquin. But as much as Astor's thought processes were logical, he would simply hire the best, most experienced men he could for each position. They lacked an overall accounting for the variability of human temperaments, perspectives, and experiences. And, unfortunately for the men embarking on the Tonquin, there were scarcely two cultures more at odds than that of Captain Thorn's disciplined navy and that of the purely pragmatic, often romanticized voyageurs. The Tonquin set sail from New York City on September 8, 1810, carrying a crew of 34 men. They rounded Cape Horn and stopped off in Hawaii before arriving at the mouth of the Columbia River on the 22nd of March, 1811. During the entirety of the journey, Captain Thorn had proven increasingly at odds with the voyageurs. They found him wildly overbearing, while he found them slothful and disorganized. Thorn saw his obedience to the orders of Astor as his primary responsibility, while the voyageurs viewed themselves as skilled and knowledgeable tradesmen who had hired on for a job they intended to do well. However, they had no intentions nor inclinations to adhere to what they saw as the captain's overly strict policies and timelines. En route to the Pacific Northwest, Thorn's adherence to schedule was tested beyond what he considered to be reasonable bounds. On December 4, 1810, when the Tonquin had pulled into Port Egmont in the Falkland Islands in order to gather supplies and make minor repairs, 8 men had ventured into the interior of the islands in hopes of procuring more provisions. When they proved slightly tardy on their return, Thorn saw fit to sail away with the remainder of the crew and leave the 8 men stranded on the remote island. Desperate and with little other option, the 8 men struck out desperately in their rowboat in hopes of catching up with the Tonquin. After 6 exhausting hours, the men in the rowboat managed to come within sight of the Tonquin. One of the crewmen, a man named Robert Stewart, threatened to kill the captain should he not turn around to rescue the men and the rowboat. Thorn, rightfully taking the threat quite seriously, obliged to Stewart and his cohort's demands, and the 8 crewmen were subsequently rescued. While Thorn had seen the action as a necessary imposition of discipline, the trappers and crewmen, who were not military men, saw it as a dishonorable and wholly condemnable action. Thorn, for his part, had become increasingly frustrated with the laissez-faire attitude of the fur traders. He found the jovial atmosphere they created as inappropriate, dismissive, and even dangerous. By the time the Tonquin sailed into the waters of Hawaii's Kaleakua Bay on the 12th of February 1811, the crew and the captain were seemingly irreparably at odds. Though he was a stalwart disciplinarian, Thorn did see the necessity in maintaining at least some semblance of cordiality between himself and the crew. So, while in Hawaii, Thorn finally made a temporary peace between himself and the senior partner fur traders. Thorn recruited 24 Hawaiian Kanaka laborers to assist in the day-to-day work that awaited the crew of the Tonquin upon their arrival in the Pacific Northwest. The Tonquin left Hawaii behind on March 1, 1811. 3 weeks later, on March 22, 1811, the ship came into sight of its most formidable challenge yet, the Columbia River. Among the tasks that Thorn had been charged with by Astor was the building of a permanent trading post near the critical geographical point where the Columbia River pours into the Pacific Ocean. Even today, the swirling, raging waters of the area provide a daunting task for sailors in modern-day vessels to navigate. But Thorn was unmoved by the fearful sight of the violent, churning waters. His concern was only the task at hand. Thus, on a particularly stormy day, he ordered 5 men to cast out in a rowboat and make their way into the middle of the waters to sound the bottom or determine the depth of the water so that the larger ship could find a spot on the formidable sandbar deep enough for it to get through. The terrified men beseeched Thorn with heartfelt pleas for their lives, as they saw venturing into the turbulent waters before them as tantamount to suicide. J.C. Fox, a veteran Boston sailor and Thorn's first mate, was appointed to lead the task. He was ordered to take a crew composed of 3 French Canadians who had never been to sea before, and an aging Yankee sailor who would be of marginal use at the oars. He protested vociferously to the captain, who only dismissed the terrified young man by turning his back to him and remarking that if he was so afraid of water, he should have stayed in Boston. Thorn ordered them to carry on, insisting that he needed all of his experienced sailors to man the ship in the midst of the repressive squall they were currently enduring. Ultimately, Fox mournfully obliged. He sorrowfully addressed his comrades, saying that his uncle had left his bones at the bottom of this channel only a year before, trying to make the treacherous crossing himself, and that now he would join him. It would be only minutes later when the boat would capsize amidst the waves, killing all 5 men on board. 3 days later, on the 25th of March 1811, another crew of 5 men was ordered to repeat the same mission that had killed their unfortunate comrades scarcely 48 hours earlier. Their small rowboat met the same fate, being capsized in short order amidst the crashing waters. However, this time, one American crew member and one of the Hawaiian Kanakas managed to miraculously make their way to shore after a horrifically harrowing ordeal that saw both nearly succumb to drowning and then hypothermia. The next day, the Tonquin was able to navigate past the sandbar, laying anchor in Baker Bay. Thorn and the remaining members of the crew then came ashore. Over the succeeding few weeks, the crew of the voyageurs and the remaining Hawaiians would construct a trading post. This post would blossom into an economic hub and is today the town of Astoria, Oregon. As they labored, much of the conversation amongst the men was conducted amongst themselves in their native tongues, so as to be indiscernible to Captain Thorn. But it was clear to the captain, from their tone alone, that the crew were nearing a mutinous fervor. Still, the mission carried on. As the months passed, trade was carried out with curious locals, such as the Clatsop people, a Chinookan tribe that had been encountered by the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1805. Thorn pressed the Clatsop for information on any of their neighbors to the north who might be open to trading as well. He was referred to the Cleoquiot tribe, who resided around the Cleoquiot Bay some 430 miles to the north. The Cleoquiot, meaning the people from Cleoqua or Cleoqui, had recently engaged in peaceable trading with a number of European merchants. They were a hunter-gathering people, descendants of the Nunchanuls. Scant years before, in the late 1700s, they had engaged in prolonged and vicious intertribal warfare in efforts to rid their territories of foreign invaders from rival nations. Thorn was encouraged by the potential profit source and dismissive of any military threat that might be posed against his superiorly armed men aboard their state-of-the-art ship. And so, on June 5, 1811, the Tonquin again crossed the sandbar, leaving the waters of the bay and heading north, again, towards current-day Vancouver, British Columbia. As they traveled north, they stopped intermittently to come ashore and trade with other tribes along the way. During one of these stops, they hired a local native named Hosea Kiao to serve as their interpreter as they continued on northward. Thorn was again cautioned against venturing into the Cleoquiot's territory, as they had recently had some tense dealings with other European traders. Thorn, again, dismissed any threat posed by the natives paddling cedar canoes and wielding homemade war clubs against his mighty and well-armed vessel. During the second week of June, the Tonquin finally made its way into the waters of Cleoquiot Sound. Alexander Mackay, the most experienced Scottish fur trader on board the ship, and Hosea Kiao went ashore to establish relations with the Cleoquiot. They were received peaceably, even being welcome to stay the night in the chief's longhouse. The next day, as Mackay and Hosea Kiao established trade on shore, a number of Cleoquiot canoes went out to the Tonquin in hopes of bartering for more goods than Mackay and Hosea Kiao had brought with them. Before leaving to come ashore, Mackay had cautioned Captain Thorn of this eventuality, and warned him not to let too many Cleoquiot on board at once. Thorn, wholly inexperienced in trading with natives save for his most recent dealings in the past few weeks, brushed Mackay's concerns aside, again reassuring him that the Tonquin's might rendered it practically invincible to native attack. As curious Cleoquiot clambered on board, Thorn ordered several blankets spread out on deck and trade goods laid upon them. Believing himself a shrewd bargainer, Thorn attempted engaging a Cleoquiot elder, a chief known as Nukami, in trade. He offered 2 blankets, an assortment of beads, and a number of metal fishhooks in exchange for 1 otter pelt, an offer he felt to be more than charitable. Nukami, however, was an experienced and shrewd dealmaker, a veteran of countless dealings with Europeans and other natives throughout his long life. He rejected Thorn's offer outright, scornfully condemning it as egregiously low. Nukami insisted on 5 blankets. Thorn saw this as outright extortion. He angrily turned his back to the chief, stalking off towards his quarters. The chief, indignant himself, followed the captain, taunting him for being such a weak bargainer and waving the otter pelts in the air. Incensed, the captain grabbed one of the furs and, according to varying accounts, either struck the chief with it or rubbed it in his face, shouting, "Damn your eyes!" He subsequently threw Nukami and all of his cohorts off of the Tonquin, and sent word for Mackay and Hosea Kiao to return. Mackay was horrified at the captain's pomposity, and the experienced traders in the crew now all believed themselves to be in great danger. They insisted that now was the time for the Tonquin to pull up anchors and to take its leave, but Captain Thorn would hear none of it. Just after sunrise on the following morning, a singular canoe appeared on the water, pulling up next to the Tonquin. Captain Thorn, as well as much of the rest of the crew, was still asleep. The Cleoquiot inside the canoe held up furs and made overtures of peace towards the crewmen on watch, who were convinced to let the small ship come aboard. Captain Thorn, as well as Mackay and Hosea Kiao, were summoned to the deck, and trading was commenced. But soon, more canoes began to flock to the Tonquin. At first, just a few, but then more, and then more. Again, Mackay and Hosea beseeched Captain Thorne to only allow a small group of Kleoquiot on board at a time. Again, Thorne dismissed their concerns wholeheartedly. Hosea then noticed that many of the Kleoquiot warriors wore fur mantles draped over their necks and shoulders, a curious wardrobe choice considering the warm June weather. Yet again, the captain roundly condemned the idea of being caught off guard by a surprise attack. Finally, the number of Kleoquiot on board the Tonquin became unmanageable, and yet still, the canoes continued to pull up next to the Tonquin. Finally, Thorne was forced to order the decks cleared and the topsails unfurled, and the anchor weighed. The mood on board the ship, and that of Thorne in particular, was rapidly devolving from one of joviality to one of panicked suspicion. As the preparations were being made to move, and the Kleoquiot were being ushered off the Tonquin and back into their canoes, James Lewis, acting as the ship's clerk, had been hunched down next to a bale of blankets, taking stock of inventory. Suddenly, a startling, bone-chilling war cry rang out, piercing the muggy summer air. The Kleoquiot chief standing next to Lewis brandished a large hunting knife, burying it deep into the unfortunate American's back. Lewis fell forward into the ship's companionway, alive but grievously wounded, and a massacre ensued on board the Tonquin. Mackay, standing nearby, was the only crewman who had broken the typical policy which barred anyone from carrying arms above deck without explicit permission, and snuck a pistol into his waistband. With the advent of the attack, Mackay, the seasoned, strong-willed Scotsman, pulled the weapon and made use of its single shot in disposing a lone Kleoquiot warrior. The other warriors immediately leapt upon Mackay, bludgeoning him mercilessly with the war clubs they had concealed beneath their furs. Mackay was then tossed, barely alive, into a canoe where he was dispatched by Kleoquiot women with large oars. Next to fall was Thorne, who in fact fought valiantly and viciously with a pocket knife he kept on his person as he made a desperate bid to get to the cache of weapons kept on board. He managed to eviscerate 4 of his assailants, though he suffered several grievous wounds in the process. He, too, was soon felled by a mighty strike from a war club. The bulk of the pitiable crew on board were then cut and clubbed down over the next few minutes, as the Kleoquiot exacted their revenge for the captain's disrespect. Every sailor on the decks was killed, save for the native translator, Hosea. Also still alive was James Lewis, who had dragged himself into the shadows and hidden for the remainder of the attack. Now satisfied, the Kleoquiot took what goods they fancied most and returned to their canoes, rowing across the placid, chilly waters as the imposing Tonquin now sat still, with its crew cold in death. However, in a miraculous oversight, the Kleoquiot had overlooked the 7 sailors who had climbed into the ship's rigging to unfurl the topmast. After the Kleoquiot made their exit, the sailors made their way to the deck, and then below deck, where they found the dying Lewis. Lewis, resigned to his fate, had told the remaining survivors to cast out in one of the rowboats, and that he would stay behind. He burned for revenge against the Kleoquiot, and sought to make his last act his retribution. He requested only that he be left with a line of gunpowder stretching from where he lay to the ship's powder magazine, which contained nearly 9,000 pounds of gunpowder. He would wait until he returned the next day, which all assumed to be a certainty, as there was still so much valuable loot left on board. Then, he would blow the ship up. This, he hoped, would create time for his cohorts to escape and eliminate as many of their pursuers as possible. After jarring farewells, the men left Lewis alone with his thoughts as they slipped away in the rowboat. And now, here he sits, retching in pain and smiling to himself as the ship grows heavier and heavier with the weight of the Kleoquiot climbing on board. Before long, roughly 200 warriors swarmed the deck and hulls of the once mighty vessel, now but a carcass to be scavenged. Perhaps Lewis takes one last look at the brilliant British Columbia sky, or thinks once more of his upstate New York home, or the Hawaiian Islands, the Falklands, the bar rooms of New York City, or the beaches of Oahu. Then, as Hosea watches from the shore, unaware that there are any survivors at all, the Tonquin, erupts in what is likely the largest explosion that will be seen in the Pacific Northwest until World War II's battle for the Aleutian Islands. A din of grief and horror erupt from the Cleoquiot assembled on shore as a giant fireball consumes what is left of the Tonquin within minutes. Not only is this a tragedy for the Cleoquiot, but the explosion has not served its secondary purpose in providing a distraction for the escaping sailors. According to Hosea Kial, they are soon blown to shore by a fierce gale and captured. In retribution for the killing of their tribesmen, the sailors are summarily tortured to death. It will be weeks later when word finally reaches Fort Astoria, passed on by reluctant natives who now seem to be inexplicably fleeing the area. Save for Hosea Kial, who is now a prisoner of the Cleoquiot, there are no survivors. The entire crew of the Tonquin, as well as the ship itself, have been lost. Word will make its way to Astor, who will find himself much aggrieved, but more determined than ever to establish a trading foothold in the territory. But the many tales of Astor's ambitions, as well as those of the plight of the peoples of the Pacific Northwest who will suffer untold hardships in the years to follow, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. May 27th, 1831. Present-day southern Kansas. A group of New Mexico-based merchants are gathered in a tight cluster, making their way southwest down the Cimarron River. They are nervous, with an unspoken tension pervading the air that surrounds their small party. They have stopped to take a respite from the late spring heat, having just completed the trading they had come so far to engage in. But here, in the open expanses of the prairie, business was not always just business. Things here on the southern plains could, and often did, devolve quickly into overt, horrific violence. It was not wholly uncommon for an enterprising, overly optimistic merchant to venture out into these lands with hopes of brokering highly profitable trades and solidifying lucrative relationships with the rulers of this harsh, unremitting territory, the Comanche. Many of these hopeful capitalists were simply never seen again. Some returned wealthy men, some returned traumatized survivors of Comanche wrath. These merchants, though, had managed to broker mutually beneficial relationships with the Comanche that had lasted for decades by this point in the early 19th century. They had occupied the territories of what is now the state of New Mexico and was then known as New Spain for generations, nearly as long as the Comanche. In the preceding century and a half, the Comanche had unleashed a torrent of violence across what are now the states of Kansas, Colorado, Oklahoma, Texas, and New Mexico. Their motivations were in part retribution, payback for their cruel treatment at the hands of neighboring tribes like the Cheyenne and Blackfoot, and in part ambition. They, like the Spanish to the south, were intent on capturing as much of the wide-open expanses of the American frontier as possible. But for all their reputation as war fighters and empire builders, they were also incredibly adept traders. Of course, the threat of mortal violence is a powerful bargaining chip, but the Comanche prided themselves on being knowledgeable and formidable negotiators and bartering for the goods they desired. These New Mexico merchants had largely avoided the violence of Comanche expansion by providing them with a reliable, sustainable source of trade for the goods they valued but could not produce themselves. The Comanche possessed the largest collective swath of North American territory of any tribe on the continent. They were rich in land, buffalo meat, buffalo hides, and horses. But they had no tradition in pottery nor weaving, nor any access to metals such as copper and iron that they highly prized. The iron was highly prized for use as arrow and spearheads, while the copper was often beaten into discs and worn as jewelry on necklaces, bracelets, or woven into the long braids of thick hair the Comanche prided themselves on. Many of the paints that they could procure from traders were of more vibrant hues and resilient finishes than the ones they made themselves from natural dyes and animal fats. Cotton shirts, hats, jewelry, and of course, firearms were all prized to differing degrees by the Comanche, and, more often than not, the Comanche bartered with men like this small group of weary, weather-beaten traders who were often comprised of small bands of family members were close friends. They were the descendants of Spanish settlers who had often intermarried into the surrounding tribes. Their way of life in the desolate expanses of New Mexico and West Texas was a perpetually difficult, dangerous affair. But after peace with the Comanche had been brokered by Governor Juan Bautista de Anza in 1778, trade between the Spanish descendant settlers of New Spain and the Comanche began in earnest. Before long, a regular system of trade was established where intrepid bands of traders ventured out into the no-man's land that was Comancheria. Most were men from hard backgrounds who found little comparable opportunity anywhere else. Many died hard, horrendous deaths at the hands of the Comanche or other tribes like the Apache or the Kiowa. Many were robbed, many were killed, and many robbed and killed others. They developed their own fringe society away from the norms of New Spain or the burgeoning power of the United States. They became known as Comancheros for their proclivity and aptitude for dealing with a tribe whose mere mention could send waves of panic through settlements all through Texas and Mexico. This particular group of Comancheros here on the Cimarron River had traveled a long way to conduct their business, and now only hoped to get home with their profits as soon as possible. They spoke briefly in their huddled formation about the trades that they had made, the profits they had taken, and their unanimous desire to put distance between themselves and the party of Comanche they had just traded with. To a man, the small party was aware that there was nothing to stop the Comanche from trailing them for a while, only to kill them all, recoup the items they had traded away, and walk away with little to no consequence. But just as they were about to resume their course southward, one of them spots a figure only a few hundred yards in the distance. Even at this distance, it is clear the figure approaching them on horseback is not a Comanche. As the rider comes toward them, he attempts to wave them down to engage in conversation. As he draws nearer, it becomes apparent that he is an American. In fact, though the Comancheros would have no way of knowing it, this was one of the most well-known and well-traveled Americans alive at the time. While the Comancheros knew the vast expanses of their homeland like the backs of their hands, they did not know, nor in many instances could they scarcely imagine, the scope or extremity of this American man's travels in the previous decade. Barring but a few possible exceptions, this lone rider had seen more of the North American continent than anyone alive at the time. He had come from upstate New York, worked on freighter ships that sailed the expanses of the Great Lakes, and made his way to the burgeoning city of St. Louis. From there, he had traveled from the Dakotas to the Rocky Mountains, the Mojave Desert, the missions of Southern California, the San Joaquin Valley, the Sierra Nevadas, San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and then all the way north through present-day Oregon and Washington into Canada. He had survived the deadliest attacks on record, from the Arikara in South Dakota to the Mojave in California to the Umpqua in Oregon. He had worked with and under some of the most legendary names in mountain man history, men like William Ashley, Hugh Glass, Jim Bridger, William Wolfskill, Milton Sublette, William Sublette, Joseph Meek, and Bill Williams, to name but a few. Most of the men he had traveled and worked with, though, had died violent deaths in their pursuit of fortune in the wilds of a continent that they, in the initial throes of manifest destiny, believed to be rightfully and inherently theirs. He had narrowly survived a vicious mauling by an enraged grizzly bear, one that necessitated his ear being sewn back onto his head via crude frontier surgery without the benefit of anesthetic. This incident left him permanently scarred and saw him wear his hair longer from then on in order to hide the scars. He had been detained by Mexican officials in California who were in fact rightfully dubious as to the intentions of these curiously dressed Americans who claimed they were merely passing through their bountiful territory. Through it all, he had remained steadfast in his faith as a Methodist and his ardent commitment to the venture capitalism he hoped would provide for his family. His name was Jedediah Strong Smith. Just the year before, he had made his way back to St. Louis, cashed in on the pelts he had collected at the price of so many lives lost and miles covered, and vowed never to enter the mountains again. He purchased a sizable home on what is now Broadway Street in St. Louis and sent a banknote for $1,500 back to Ohio in order to purchase land neighboring one of his brother's farms. 3 of his younger brothers had come to live with him in St. Louis, where he hoped to be able to provide them with better economic opportunity than he had found upon his initial forays from home at their age. He repeatedly swore in numerous correspondence to family and friends that his days in the mountains were done. His mother had recently passed away, and the incessant internal tumult that had hounded him since he left home, another sentiment that often litters the journal entries and letters of Jedediah Smith, incessantly harped at his conscience that he should travel to his family's new homestead in Ohio to care for his aging father. But in the time since returning to St. Louis in 1829 and the spring of 1831, the incessant wanderlust that had driven him to such distances began to drown out the guilt that he felt for his extended departure from his home and family. He had written to the Secretary of War, John Eaton, requesting to be made part of a proposed military expedition into the Rocky Mountains. To be sure, there would be few men in the world more qualified to lead the expedition than Jedediah Smith, but Smith never received a response from Eaton, and the expedition never materialized. Smith then began to look towards the prospect of publishing his memoirs, along with the numerous maps he had compiled during his travels. Even throughout the most dire of times in his travels, Smith had, with at least some measure of consistency, recorded his thoughts in a series of journals. In addition, he was a skilled cartographer whose maps were accurate and reliable. He hoped to illuminate the entirety of the eastern seaboard and perhaps even Europe with tales of his exploits complete with the maps that he had drawn. To do this, though, he felt he needed to add at least one trip to his already expansive list of expeditions. The town of Santa Fe, in what is now the state of New Mexico, had been growing in population and reputation as a trading post and way stop on the trip to California. And so, after not hearing back from Secretary of War Eaton, Smith decided to sign on with an expedition to Santa Fe with William Sublett and David Jackson. The 3 men would lead a wagon train carrying roughly $20,000 in goods to Santa Fe. Smith also enlisted Samuel Parkman to assist in arranging his writings and maps into a publishable manuscript, as well as to polish his Spanish skills so that he might decipher some of the Spanish terms recorded in Smith's diaries with more accuracy. The trail from St. Louis to Santa Fe was well traveled, and even in 1831 was considered well established and comparatively safe. Few lives were lost annually to either privation or attacks from natives. In comparison to the trips Smith had been making for the past decade, this endeavor would have seemed to be a relatively easy affair, despite the distance being over 1,000 miles. The wagon train, complete with 83 men, left for Santa Fe in the spring of 1831, in high spirits with aspirations of completing a timely, profitable trip. They headed southwest, and initially, all had gone well. Then, trouble began to befall the party. First, on May 19th, a company clerk who had long worked for Sublett and Jackson, a man recorded only as Mentor, was murdered by Pawnee warriors when he wandered off from the main party near the Pawnee River, a tributary of the Arkansas River. Then, the water began to run out. By May 27th, the party was completely out of water for both men and livestock. All the established water sources on the trail had thus far proven dried up. On that morning, much the same as they had for the previous few mornings, Smith and his cohorts would pair up and fan out in different directions from their camp in an attempt to find any viable water sources. Smith and his partner, a man named Fitzpatrick, headed south on that morning, hoping to find a spring on the north side of the Cimarron River. The Cimarron itself flows through several mineral deposits, rendering the water not potable as it is too salty. However, several springs lie nearby the river which do produce drinkable water. Smith and Fitzpatrick thought perhaps they were getting close that morning when they had happened upon a depression in the flat landscape that harbored damp ground at its lowest point. Smith directed Fitzpatrick to stay there and attempt to dig for water in the depression, while he rode ahead to see if there were any springs nearby. While Fitzpatrick began digging, Smith headed off further south. Within a few miles, he was out of sight of Fitzpatrick. Within a few more, he came into sight of this band of Comancheros. The Comancheros are alarmed. The legendary mountain man lopes his horse towards them, speaking to them in broken Spanish, asking where water might be found. To the Comancheros, he presents a clear and present danger not only to himself, but to them as well. The Comancheros offer him no water, and only point him towards a spring a few miles away. The Comancheros offer him no water, and only point him towards a spring a few miles away. They also inform him in concise, broken English that the Comanche were nearby and that he would not be able to avoid them no matter his next move. Furthermore, he is informed that he must make the next move immediately, as he presented a liability to the Comancheros' party. Should the Comanche find him in their company, they might suppose him to be a spy and kill them all. This was not a risk the Comancheros were willing to take for the lonesome and now doubtless fear-stricken American. He was on his own. Seeing no better course of action, Jedediah Smith continues on in the direction of the spring the Comancheros had informed him of. He departs from the Comancheros, resolutely making his way forward and mustering all the courage and wherewithal he might bring to bear. He and his party would surely die without the water, and while he knew there was a very real possibility that the Comanche would usher him into an even more immediate end, Smith saw little other course of action. As the Comancheros watched from a distance, he makes his way further south, to what is now known as Wagon Bed Spring in southwestern Kansas. Just before he reaches the spring, a band of 15 to 20 Comanches come upon him. They have spotted Smith before he even departed the Comanchero party, and spent the time it took him to ride to the spring discussing in Spanish what they would do with this trespassing American. For all intents and purposes, Smith and his company were indeed trespassing. In fact, the entire trade they had been plying for the past decade or more was technically illegal and in violation of numerous treaties that forbade hunting and trapping in native or foreign lands. The Comanche, though, are not concerned with the legalities of any particular treaty on this day. They see him as an intolerable interloper, a representative of a people who have sought to invade their lands. Also, they may have seen him as sport. Smith does his best to stay calm, hailing the Comanche with a smile and signing to them in the ubiquitous sign language of the plains that he was merely passing through and hoping to slake his thirst as well as his horses. He searches the faces of the Comanche warriors who surround him, the notoriously stout and rugged-looking ponies striking such an odd juxtaposition against their master's formidable reputation. The Comanche, too, look different than any of the other tribes Smith has encountered on the plains. They themselves are shorter and stockier than their northern plains counterparts, with, especially at this time in the early 19th century, little of the cosmetic adornments of their plains cohorts, such as war bonnets or white-boned breastplates. The Comanche, in particular, cut a stark, terrifying figure even for the most experienced of travelers on the frontier. And, in accordance with their reputation, no warrior among them returns Smith's smile or salutations. For a few tense, terrifying seconds, the two parties stare silently at each other. Then, the Comanche begin to encircle Smith, moving into their positions while taunting Smith's horse, trying to spook him into throwing his rider. Smith, for his part, still attempts to broker some kind of peace that might allow him to trade some of his valuables for his safe passage back to his party. But as the situation rapidly develops, it becomes clear that the Comanche are not interested in any deal. Just as the Comanche have Smith half surrounded in a crescent moon formation, a shot rings out from a Comanche rifle. A lead ball tears into Jedediah Smith's right shoulder, as the noise simultaneously startles his horse, causing both animal and rider to wheel about 180 degrees. Smith had laid his Kentucky rifle across his lap before being accosted by the Comanche, and as his horse turned, Smith managed to shoulder the weapon and return fire, killing one of the warriors, whom later accounts would describe as a chief. As the Comanche warrior's body slumps from his mount and thuds to the hard Kansas dirt, Jedediah Smith reaches for one of the 2 single-shot pistols he keeps tucked in his belt. In the seconds it takes to accomplish this, the remaining Comanche warriors, now fully enraged at the killing of one of their own, pounce upon Smith, knocking him off of his horse. As soon as he hits the ground, it is all but certain Jedediah Smith knows he is going to die. The Comanche have spent so much effort attaining their empire in the southern plains, largely because of the immense buffalo herds that reliably roamed its expanses. In order to kill the gigantic, aggressive, and fleet-of-foot buffalo, the Comanche often employed the use of 12 to 14-foot spears that could be used to stab a buffalo from a distance. The animal would be struck under the ribs, so that the most damage might be done to the target's internal organs. The same tactic was employed against human enemy targets. From atop their stout ponies, the remaining Comanche drove their lances into the torso of America's most legendary, accomplished mountain man. The attack is incredibly swift and unspeakably violent, as the Comanche mock and club the dying man. The only mercy for the unfortunate Smith is that it is all over in a matter of seconds. As his body lies lifeless, covered in blood and plains dust, the Comanche strap their dead compatriot to his horse, take Smith's horse, his guns, and valuables, and leave him to the buzzards and the summer sun. Jedediah Smith's body would never be found, and it would be days later until the Comancheros would encounter the sublet Jackson party on the Santa Fe Trail. Here, they would produce Smith's pistols and rifle to his grief-stricken younger brother, Austin. The Comancheros had traded the Comanche for the items after their murder of Smith and acquired the Comanche's side of the story. They corroborated this with their own eyewitness accounts, and these accounts were relayed back to Smith's elderly widower father in Ohio in a letter from Austin Smith. The letter, heart-wrenching in its revelations even 2 centuries later, reads as follows. Your son Jedediah was killed on the Cimarron the 27th of May, on his way to Santa Fe by the Comanche Indians. His party was in distress for water, and he had gone alone in search of the above river, which he found when he was attacked by 15 or 20 of them. They succeeded in alarming his animal, not daring to fire on him so long as they kept face to face. So soon as his horse turned, they fired, and wounded him in the shoulder. He then fired his gun and killed their head chief. It is supposed they rushed upon him and dispatched him. An obituary would be published for him that fall in the Illinois Intelligencer, but no mention of his death was made in his adopted hometown of St. Louis's local publication. His memoirs and maps would not only not be published, but his legacy and legend would be largely forgotten by the public for the better part of a century and a half. Jedediah Smith never married, nor had any children. In his brief 32 years, he had managed to incessantly, seemingly impulsively, pursue his intentions of wealth and security to ends that had thus far been unheard of in American history. To add even more to the decidedly unserendipitous nature of Smith's final expedition, the remainder of the party on the Santa Fe Trail, including Sublette, Jackson, and Smith's younger brother Austin, were all able to find water and eventually make their way safely to Santa Fe. From here, Austin Smith would pursue his own successful career in mercantilism, and Sublette and Jackson would continue on to California in order to return with a large remuda of horses and mules to trade and sell in Santa Fe and Missouri. In the entirety of the year of 1831, the only lives lost on the Santa Fe Trail would be those of the unfortunate Minter at the hands of the Pawnee, and Smith at the hands of the Comanche. Life in the Old West was always hard, and often cheap. The violence and hardships that befell people of all races religions, and backgrounds could be startlingly indiscriminate and stunningly swift. And so it was that one of the most expansive, interesting lives in American history was snuffed out. Despite all his exploits, he found himself but a stranger in a strange land, in the wrong place, at the wrong time. But the annals of Old West history are replete with far more stories of Smith, his fellow mountain men, as well as the countless natives and settlers they interacted with. Tales of lives lost, fortunes gained, and miles traveled are more numerous than the stars in the open western sky. But for tonight, those are other stories for other times. Thank you for tuning in. Be sure to hit like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, History Too Real for the Westerns.